I stepped out of the heavy iron gates of the Federal Correctional Institution, pulling the thin fabric of my gray prison-issued sweatpants tight against the morning chill. 5 years. 60 long, agonizing months of waking up to the sound of steel doors sliding shut and the smell of industrial cleaner. I took a deep breath of the free air, letting it fill my lungs. I looked across the empty visitor parking lot. There was no welcome party. There were no balloons, no tearful hugs, and certainly no family waiting to drive me home. Instead, there was just a sleek black SUV idling quietly by the curb. A man in a sharp tailored navy suit stepped out, adjusting his silk tie. I recognized him instantly. He was the bulldog attorney my white son-in-law Preston kept on retainer to clean up his messes. The lawyer did not smile. He did not offer his hand or a ride into town. He simply walked up to me, pulling a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. He handed me a crisp piece of paper and a cashier's check. $10,000. And right beneath it, a legally binding restraining order. "Take the money," he said, his tone dripping with fake pity. "Move to another state. Start over quietly. Do not ever contact Jasmine or Preston again. If you come within 500 feet of them or any of the Sterling properties, you will violate your parole and you will go right back inside." I looked at the check, then up at his smug face and let out a soft, cold laugh. Before I tell you exactly what I did with that insulting $10,000 bribe, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever been pushed into the dark by the very people you sacrificed everything to keep in the light. Now let me tell you how my first day of freedom became their absolute worst nightmare. My name is Vivian Ross. I am 62 years old. Until my own flesh and blood threw me to the wolves, I was the undisputed queen of commercial real estate and gourmet hospitality in Atlanta. I built an empire from the dirt up, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. Standing there on that gravel, listening to this overpaid errand boy tell me to disappear from my own city, the memories of my sacrifice burned in my chest. I felt the phantom calluses on my hands from the years I spent in my 20s scrubbing hotel room floors. I worked 3 different housekeeping jobs, pushing heavy carts down endless hallways, just so my daughter Jasmine would never know what it meant to go hungry. I paid for her private school uniforms, her violin lessons, her college tuition at Spelman. I gave her the world so she would not have to struggle the way I did. And how did she repay her mother? By letting her slick, greedy husband convince her to forge my signature on federal tax documents. They created a web of phantom corporations siphoning millions into offshore accounts. And when the IRS finally came knocking, they pointed the finger directly at me. My own daughter sat on the witness stand crying those perfect crocodile tears, telling the judge she had no idea her mother was involved in white-collar crime. She watched them put me in handcuffs and take away everything I had ever built. The lawyer tapped his expensive watch, pulling me back to the present. He was clearly annoyed that I was making him stand out in the prison parking lot. "I need an answer, Vivian," he said, crossing his arms. "Preston is a very powerful man in Atlanta now. He is willing to be generous today, but you need to sign the non-disclosure agreement. Take this check and get on a Greyhound bus. Do not make this harder than it has to be. You are a convicted felon with nothing. You have no leverage here." I held up the crisp $10,000 check. The morning sunlight caught the ink on the zeros. For a brief second, I thought about how much money this used to mean to me back when I was a young single mother trying to keep the electricity from being shut off. I thought about the sheer disrespect of trying to buy my silence for pennies on the dollar of what they stole from me. Then, without breaking eye contact with the lawyer, I gripped the edges of the check and slowly tore it right down the middle. He blinked, his arrogant posture faltering for a second. I stacked the 2 torn halves together and tore them again. I let the tiny pieces of paper flutter out of my hands, watching them land on the wet gravel right at the tips of his polished Italian leather shoes. "Tell Preston my life's work is worth a hell of a lot more than 10 grand, I said. My voice was barely above a whisper, but it was as steady and sharp as a scalpel. "Tell him I know exactly how he bought his power. Tell him I know about the dirty money. And tell my daughter that I will not be erased by a signature she forged." The lawyer's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, probably to threaten me with the police or the parole board, but I did not give him the chance. I turned my back on him and began walking away, my cheap canvas prison sneakers crunching on the gravel. I headed straight down the long, empty road. The sound of his heavy car door slamming and his tires squealing as he sped away told me everything I needed to know. They thought I would be broken. They thought prison would turn me into a frightened old woman begging for scraps. They were wrong. They were terrified, and they had every right to be. I walked for nearly 2 miles until I reached a gas station on the edge of the county line. The Georgia heat was already starting to rise, pressing down on my shoulders, but I felt nothing but cold determination. I walked into the convenience store, ignoring the strange looks from the cashier, who clearly recognized my gray prison sweats. I pulled a crumpled $20 bill from my pocket. It was the only money I had left in the world, the gate money they gave me upon release. I bought a bottle of water and asked to use the payphone in the corner. I dialed a local taxi service. When the dispatcher answered, I did not ask to go to a halfway house. I did not ask to go to a cheap motel on the bad side of town. I gave them the address of the Grand Magnolia Pavilion, the most exclusive, breathtaking 5-star hotel in the heart of downtown Atlanta. It was a crown jewel of modern architecture, featuring crystal chandeliers, imported marble floors, and a rooftop restaurant where the elite of the city gathered to show off their wealth. It was also the very first luxury hotel I had ever built from the ground up, and according to the newspapers I had read in the prison library, it was the exact location where Jasmine and Preston were hosting a massive charity gala that very morning. When the yellow cab pulled up to the gas station, the driver took one look at my outfit and hesitated. "You got money for the fare, lady?" he asked, eyeing me suspiciously through the rolled-down window. I opened the back door and slid onto the cracked leather seat. "Just drive me to the Grand Magnolia," I told him, staring straight ahead at the road. "Do not worry about the fare. The people throwing the party are going to pay for it." As the cab merged onto the highway, heading toward the glittering skyline of the city, I closed my eyes and leaned back. 5 years of sitting in a cell had given me a lot of time to think. It had given me time to plan to study every loophole in the real estate laws and to map out exactly how I was going to dismantle their empire piece by piece. Preston thought he was a mastermind. Jasmine thought she had secured her place in high society. But they were playing checkers, and I had been playing chess since before they were born. I was coming home not to beg for forgiveness, but to collect what was mine, and the show was about to begin. The yellow cab pulled up to the grand entrance of the Magnolia Pavilion. I stepped out into the humid Atlanta air. The valet, a young man in a crisp uniform, took one look at my baggy gray prison sweatpants and faded canvas shoes, and immediately stepped forward to block my path. I did not even break my stride. I looked him dead in the eye and called him by his first name. I hired his mother as my head concierge 10 years ago. He recognized my face, swallowed hard, and stepped aside. I walked through the towering glass doors and into the grand lobby. The air conditioning washed over me, carrying the familiar scent of fresh lilies and expensive floor wax. I built this place. I picked out the imported Italian marble beneath my feet. I designed the cascading crystal chandeliers hanging above me. Every corner of this building was born from my sweat and my vision, and now it was crawling with the very people who had watched me lose it all. I made my way down the long corridor toward the main ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors were slightly ajar, and I could hear the murmur of 100 wealthy guests. I slipped inside, standing in the shadows at the back of the room. The space was transformed into a sea of silk diamonds and tailored tuxedos. The elite of Atlanta were all here sipping champagne and eating caviar bought with my money. And there, standing under the spotlight on the main stage, was my daughter. Jasmine wore a breathtaking emerald green gown that easily cost $5,000. Her hair was perfectly styled, and diamonds glittered at her throat. She gripped the edges of the podium, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed emotion. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. "It has been a difficult 5 years for the Sterling family," Jasmine said, dabbing the corner of her eye with a silk tissue. When the truth about my mother came to light, when we discovered the depth of her criminal negligence, it nearly destroyed everything we had worked for. But Preston and I refused to let the Ross legacy die in disgrace. We stepped into the darkness. We took over the company, cleaned up her toxic messes, and saved the jobs of thousands of innocent employees. We stand before you today, not as victims, but as survivors. The room erupted into applause. Wealthy investors nodded in sympathy, raising their glasses to my daughter. The sheer audacity of her lies made my blood run cold. She was selling them a story of a brave daughter rescuing a company from a corrupt mother, when in reality, she was the thief wearing the crown she stole from me. I noticed a young event coordinator standing near the soundboard at the back of the room. He was holding a wireless microphone, waiting to pass it around for the question and answer session. I walked up to him gently but firmly, took the microphone from his hand, and flipped the switch to the on position. I tapped the top of the microphone twice. The sharp, booming thud echoed through the massive ballroom speakers. The applause died instantly. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room as hundreds of heads turned toward the back. The spotlight swung around, cutting through the dim light, and landed squarely on me. There I stood, a 62-year-old woman in gray prison, issued sweats surrounded by a sea of high society. Jasmine froze at the podium. All the color drained from her perfectly contoured face. She looked as if she had just seen a ghost. "Hello, Jasmine," I said, my voice steady and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I did not yell. I did not have to. The quiet authority in my tone commanded every ounce of air in the room. "I am sorry I'm late to the party. The traffic out of the federal penitentiary was terrible this morning." Murmurs of shock rippled through the crowd. People began whispering furiously to one another. Investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I saw the faces of city council members I had funded. I saw the bank executives who used to beg me for meetings, now staring at me like I was a diseased animal. None of them had visited me in prison. None of them had questioned my sudden downfall. They just moved on to the next person signing the checks. But I did not care about them. My eyes were fixed solely on the girl I had given birth to. I began walking slowly down the center aisle directly toward the stage. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I looked up at my daughter, whose hands were now visibly shaking against the wood of the podium. "That is a beautiful speech you just gave." I continued, my voice smooth as glass. "Truly inspiring. And that emerald gown is absolutely stunning. It is funny, really. That dress costs exactly what I used to make in 6 months of scrubbing hotel toilets on my hands and knees so I could pay for your private tutors. But please tell these nice people more about how hard you had to work to save the company. I just wanted to stop by and personally thank you for keeping my CEO chair warm while I took the fall for your offshore accounts." Jasmine gripped the microphone stand, her voice pitching up into a shrill panic. "Security! Security, get her out of here. She is a convicted felon. She is trespassing." 2 large security guards in black suits started moving toward me from the sides of the room, but I held up a hand, shooting them a look so fierce they froze in their tracks. I hired the head of this security firm. They knew exactly who I was. "You are ruining the family name," Jasmine screamed, completely losing her elegant composure. "You humiliated us 5 years ago, and now you come here looking like trash to destroy this gala. The Ross name means something in this city, and you dragged it through the mud." I stopped at the foot of the stage. The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone was hanging on my every word. The Ross name, I repeated, my voice dropping an octave, cold and absolute. "You do not know the first thing about the Ross name. This name was not built on trust funds, champagne galas, or white-collar fraud. It was built on blood sweat and calloused hands. It was built on double shifts and sleepless nights. I built this empire with my own 2 hands, and you and your husband stole it with a forged signature and a dirty pen. Do not you ever stand on a stage that I bought and lecture me about legacy." Suddenly, a heavy hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. I did not have to turn around to know who it was. The expensive cologne gave him away instantly. "Preston Sterling, my son-in-law." He stepped out from the crowd, his face flushed red with rage beneath his fake, charming smile. His fingers dug painfully into my collarbone as he leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. His voice was a low, vicious whisper meant only for me. "You think you are being clever, Vivian," he hissed. You think you can walk in here and embarrass me? I have 3 police captains sitting at table 4. I am texting them right now. You just violated your parole by coming within 100 feet of my wife. You are going back to a concrete cell before this party is even over. You have nothing. You are nothing. I looked at Preston. I looked at his arrogant blue eyes, his perfectly styled hair, his tailored suit bought with my life savings. He really thought he had won. He really thought a piece of paper and a few corrupt cops were enough to keep me down. I did not pull away from his grip. I simply smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the kind of smile a predator gives right before the trap snaps shut. I reached into the pocket of my gray sweatpants and pulled out a small silver USB drive. I held it up so the stage lights caught the metal. Preston looked at it, his brow furrowing in confusion. I picked up a crystal glass of champagne from the tray of a stunned waiter standing beside us. I held Preston's gaze, my smile never wavering, and I dropped the USB drive straight into the champagne. It landed with a soft plink, sinking to the bottom of the bubbling golden liquid. "You might want to dry that off quickly, Preston," I whispered back, my voice dripping with venom. "That drive contains the unredacted bank statements from the Cayman Islands account you opened in Jasmine's name, the one you used to hide the $5 million you embezzled from the development fund. The police captains at Table 4 might find it very interesting, especially since the FBI already has a copy." Preston's face went completely pale. His hand slowly dropped from my shoulder as the reality of my words washed over him. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. He stared at the glass of champagne as if it were a live grenade. I turned my back on him. I did not look at Jasmine, who was still standing frozen on the stage. I handed the microphone back to the waiter, adjusted the collar of my cheap prison shirt, and walked back up the center aisle. The wealthy investors and socialites watched me leave in stunned silence. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and walked out into the cool lobby. The war had officially begun, and I had just fired the first shot. The morning after the gala, the Atlanta sun was unforgiving. It beat down on the cracked pavement outside the cheap roadside motel I had checked into using the last of my prison gate money. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and damp carpet, but I did not care. I did not sleep anyway. My mind was sharp, moving through the pieces on the board. Preston thought he had humiliated me by threatening me with the police, but he was reacting on pure emotion. I was operating on strategy. I washed my face in the rusted sink, put my gray prison sweats back on, and walked 3 miles to the nearest electronics store to buy a cheap prepaid cell phone with the loose change I had left. Then I headed downtown to the First National Bank of Georgia. This was not just any bank. This was the institution where I had deposited tens of millions of dollars over my 30-year career. I knew the layout of the grand lobby better than my own living room. I knew the imported marble floors, the vaulted ceilings, and the quiet hum of immense wealth. As I walked through the heavy revolving glass doors, the security guard took one look at my shabby clothes and immediately stepped forward. Before he could tell me I was in the wrong building, I looked him dead in the eye and told him I needed to see the branch manager immediately. He hesitated, recognizing the tone of a woman who was used to giving orders. I did not wait for his permission. I walked straight past him and headed for the glass office in the back corner. The branch manager, an impeccably groomed man named Richard Henderson, looked up from his mahogany desk. When he recognized my face, all the blood drained from his cheeks. He had been to my house for dinner. He had drank my expensive wine and begged for my business. Now he looked at me like I was a ghost who had come to drag him to hell. I sat down in the leather chair opposite his desk and crossed my legs. I told him, "Good morning, Richard. I am here to access the Ross Emergency Trust." It was a secret account I had set up quietly before the trial began. It was completely separate from my corporate holdings. It was my safety net, my rainy day fund designed to hold exactly $250,000. It was money meant to guarantee that no matter what the judge ruled, I would not be left destitute. Richard swallowed hard. He refused to look me in the eye. He nervously adjusted his tie and began typing on his keyboard. The silence in the office stretched out tight and uncomfortable. Finally, he stopped typing and looked at his hands. He told me he was sorry, but there was no money in the account. He said the balance was 0. I sat perfectly still. I asked him how that was possible. Only I had the signature authority for that specific trust. Richard wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. He explained that during the second week of my trial, when the media circus was at its peak and the lawyers were drowning in paperwork, Preston had come into the bank. Preston had presented a sweeping financial power of attorney signed by my daughter Jasmine, who claimed I was mentally unfit to manage my affairs due to the stress of the trial. Using that loophole, Preston legally dissolved the emergency trust. He drained every single cent. He took the money I had bled for and absorbed it into his own holding company. Richard looked at me with cold, empty corporate eyes. He told me he was legally obligated to follow the power of attorney. He said I was entirely overdrawn and that my accounts were permanently closed. He politely asked me to leave the premises before he had to call security. I did not yell. I did not flip the heavy mahogany desk or scream about the injustice of it all. Anger is a luxury for the rich, and right now I was completely penniless. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my sweatpants, and walked out of his office without saying another word. I was in the middle of the grand lobby when the cheap prepaid phone in my pocket suddenly buzzed. I stopped near a marble pillar and answered it. It was Preston. He must have had his private investigators tracking my movements from the moment I left the gala. His voice came through the cheap speaker, dripping with arrogance and cruel satisfaction. He asked me how my morning at the bank was going. He laughed, a sharp, grating sound that made my jaw clench. He told me he knew exactly what I was trying to do. He said I really thought I was smarter than him hiding that little nest egg. He bragged about how easy it was to take it all away. He told me I was nothing but a broke, convicted felon standing in clothes that smelled like a prison cell. He said I could not even afford to buy a cup of coffee in the city I used to run. Then his voice dropped, losing the laughter and turning into a vicious threat. He told me that if I ever breathed a word about his offshore accounts to the authorities, he would destroy me. He said he would call the police and tell them I assaulted him at the gala. He said with my criminal record, the judge would throw me back in a maximum security cell for the rest of my natural life. He told me to crawl into a hole and die quietly. I listened to his entire rant. I listened to the slight tremor beneath his arrogant words. He was trying to sound like a king, but he sounded like a terrified little boy defending a sandcastle from the rising tide. I told him softly that a man who has truly won does not need to call his victim to brag. I told him he was scared because he knew I was coming for everything. Then I hung up the phone. I stood in the bank lobby completely broke, completely isolated, and effectively homeless. The reality of my situation should have crushed me. But then I heard a soft voice call out to me from behind the teller counter. "Miss Vivian." I turned around. Standing behind window number 4 was an older African-American woman. Her name tag read Clarice. I recognized her immediately. 8 years ago, Clarice had come to my corporate office in tears. Her teenage grandson had been accepted to a prestigious university, but the bank had denied her a loan for his tuition. She was going to lose her house trying to pay for his education. I had written her a personal check that day and told her to make sure the boy graduated with honors. I had not thought about it since. Clarice looked around the lobby nervously. The security guard was looking the other way. Richard was still hiding in his glass office. Clarice motioned for me to step closer to her window. When I approached, she did not say a word about my clothes or my recent prison sentence. She just looked at me with deep, quiet respect. She whispered that she had seen Preston come in all those years ago. She said she knew what he was doing was wrong, but she did not have the power to stop him. However, she did have the security clearance to look at the transfer logs before Preston had the account sealed and encrypted. Clarice slid a thick brown manila envelope under the narrow gap in the bulletproof glass. She whispered that she had kept it hidden in her locker for 5 years, praying I would walk back through those doors one day. She told me to go get my life back. I took the envelope, feeling the heavy weight of the paper inside. I looked Clarice in the eyes and gave her a slow, grateful nod. I turned and walked out of the First National Bank, pushing through the heavy revolving doors and stepping back out into the blistering Atlanta heat. I did not stop walking until I reached a quiet park bench 2 blocks away. My hands were perfectly steady as I tore open the seal of the manila envelope. Inside was a stack of highly classified internal bank wire transfers. They were stamped with Preston Sterling's digital signature. It was the Holy Grail. It was the exact paper trail the FBI had been desperately trying to find. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Preston had secretly wired $5 million of stolen company funds to a private offshore account in the Bahamas just 3 days before my trial began. It was the smoking gun that proved he framed me. Preston thought he had left me with absolutely nothing. He thought he had starved me out. But as I looked at the documents in my hands, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I could not afford a cup of coffee, but I had just been handed the keys to his destruction. Sunday morning arrived with a thick, humid heat that settled over Atlanta like a heavy blanket. I woke up on the stiff mattress of my cheap motel room, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. Today was Sunday. For the past 5 years, my Sundays consisted of sitting in a cinder-block room, listening to a prison chaplain read scripture to women who had lost all hope. But before my conviction, Sunday was a day of absolute routine and power. I was a pillar of the Greater Hope Community Church. It was a massive, beautiful brick building that sat on a prime piece of real estate downtown. It was the kind of church where the elite members of the African American community gathered to network to see and be seen and to display their wealth under the guise of fellowship. I knew the church intimately because my money had practically rebuilt it. When the old roof caved in during a terrible storm 15 years ago, the church council panicked. They did not have the funds to fix it, and the bank was threatening to foreclose. I wrote a check that covered the entire repair and threw in enough extra to commission beautiful new stained glass windows for the sanctuary. The pastor used to reserve a special parking spot for my town car. The ushers used to bow their heads when I walked through the double doors. I dressed in the same gray prison sweatpants and faded canvas sneakers I had been wearing since my release. I walked the 2 miles to the church, letting the morning sun warm my skin. When I arrived, the parking lot was packed with luxury vehicles. I walked up the wide stone steps and pulled open the heavy wooden doors. The air inside was cool and smelled of expensive perfume and polished oak. The choir was in the middle of their opening hymn, their voices rising in perfect harmony. I stepped into the sanctuary, and the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. The usher standing by the door, a man named Deacon Thomas, who used to send me a Christmas card every year, took one look at me and froze. He did not offer me a program. He did not smile. He simply looked away, pretending to adjust his tie. The whispers started before I even made it halfway down the side aisle. Heads turned, eyes darted toward me, and then quickly away. I was the ghost that was supposed to stay buried. I found an empty spot in the back row and sat down, keeping my back straight and my expression completely blank. My eyes scanned the massive room and settled instantly on the front row, the VIP section. There they were sitting directly in front of the pulpit. Jasmine looked like a vision in a modest but breathtakingly expensive white dress and a wide-brimmed designer hat. Preston sat right beside her wearing a crisp, light blue tailored suit. He had his arm draped protectively around the back of her pew. They looked like the perfect devoted couple. They were the golden children of the congregation, the generous benefactors who had bravely guided the family business through the darkness of my supposed crimes. Watching them play their roles made a cold fire burn in my chest. The choir finished their song, and Pastor Miller stepped up to the podium. He was a tall, charismatic man who knew exactly how to work a crowd. I had funded his community outreach programs for over a decade. I had paid for his son to go to a private summer camp, but today his eyes were cold. He glanced toward Preston and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Preston had undoubtedly bought the pastor's loyalty with a massive donation the moment I was sent away. Pastor Miller adjusted his microphone and cleared his throat. He started his sermon talking about the trials and tribulations of life. He talked about how the devil uses deception to tear down righteous families. But as the sermon went on, his words grew sharper and more pointed. He began speaking about betrayal. He told the congregation that a healthy body must reject a diseased organ to survive. He said that sometimes we must distance ourselves from toxic sinners who refuse to repent. He said that even when those sinners are our own flesh and blood, we must protect the sanctity of our community from their corrupting influence. He looked up from his Bible, and his eyes locked directly onto mine in the back row. The congregation followed his gaze. A collective murmur rippled through the pews. People were shifting in their seats, leaning over to whisper to their neighbors. They were eating up the drama. Jasmine lowered her head and pressed a lace handkerchief to her eyes, playing the part of the tragic, heartbroken daughter mourning her wicked mother. Preston sat tall, puffing out his chest, with a smug, satisfied look on his face. They thought they had successfully humiliated me in the one place I used to find peace. I did not cry. I did not hang my head in shame or rush out the back doors to hide. I sat perfectly still, waiting for the sermon to end and the offering to begin. The organ music swelled softly as the ushers began passing the heavy brass offering plates down the rows. I did not wait for the plate to reach my section. I stood up. The old wooden pew creaked loudly, breaking the reverence of the moment. Every single eye in the building turned to look at me. I stepped out into the center aisle. I began walking slowly toward the front of the church. My cheap canvas sneakers made no sound on the plush red carpet, but my presence was deafening. Pastor Miller stopped speaking, his mouth hanging open in shock. The organ player fumbled a chord, and the music faded into a tense, heavy silence. I kept my eyes locked on the altar, refusing to look at the hundreds of faces staring at me. I reached the front of the church, standing just a few feet away from where Jasmine and Preston were sitting. I looked down into the velvet-lined offering plate resting on a small wooden table below the pulpit. I reached into the pocket of my sweatpants and pulled out a single crumpled $1 bill. I took my time smoothing out the creases, flattening the paper between my fingers. Then I held it over the plate and let it drop. It fluttered down, landing silently on top of the crisp $100 bills other people had given. I turned around to face the congregation. I looked directly at Pastor Miller, and then I shifted my gaze to Jasmine. I took a deep breath and raised my voice, ensuring that every single person in the massive room could hear me clearly. I asked the church if the pastor's message about forgiveness applied to everyone sitting in the pews today. I asked loudly if God forgives a daughter who sits on a federal witness stand and commits perjury. I asked if the Lord washes away the sin of a child who lies under oath to lock her own mother in a concrete cage just so her white husband can buy a new yacht with stolen company money. The sanctuary absolutely exploded. The silence shattered into 1,000 gasps and shocked whispers. Older women in the front rows clutched their chests in horror. Deacons murmured loudly to one another, pointing fingers and shaking their heads. The pristine, flawless image that Jasmine and Preston had paid so much money to maintain was cracking violently right down the middle in the house of God. The truth was out there, floating in the air, and they could not take it back. Jasmine let out a loud, dramatic sob, covering her face completely with her hands. She stood up so fast she knocked her heavy hymnal onto the floor. She pushed past the people in her row, crying hysterically, and ran down the side aisle, rushing out the heavy wooden sanctuary doors into the morning heat. I turned to walk back down the center aisle, my head held high, feeling the eyes of the entire city on my back. But my path was suddenly blocked. Preston stepped out of the front pew and planted his body directly in front of me. His face was a deep, blotchy red. The charming Southern gentleman act was completely shattered. His fists were clenched so tightly by his sides that his knuckles were pure white. He leaned down, closing the distance between us, so only I could hear the pure venom in his voice. He promised me that I had just made the biggest mistake of my miserable life. He swore to me right there in the middle of the church aisle that he was going to completely destroy whatever was left of me. He said he would not stop until I was dead or back in chains. I looked up into his shaking, furious eyes, and I smiled. I whispered back that he could not destroy what was already coming for him. Then I stepped around him and walked slowly out the front doors, leaving him standing alone in the ruins of his own reputation. The heavy wooden church doors closed behind me, shutting out the chaos I had just unleashed inside the sanctuary. The thick, humid Georgia heat immediately wrapped around my shoulders, but I felt completely cold and focused. I walked down the wide stone steps, moving away from the building and toward the sprawling parking lot. I could hear the faint sound of the choir desperately starting another hymn inside, trying to cover up the scandal, but the damage was already done. The seed of doubt was planted in the minds of the congregation. I kept walking toward the edge of the property where the giant oak trees cast long, dark shadows over the pavement. As I reached the sidewalk, a sleek silver Bentley glided silently to a stop right in front of me, blocking my path. The tinted driver window rolled down, and a man in a black suit quickly got out to open the rear passenger door. A pair of expensive designer heels stepped onto the concrete, followed by a crisp white linen suit. It was Diane Sterling, Preston's mother. Diane was the absolute epitome of old money high society. She wore a string of pearls that had probably been in her family for generations, and her hair was styled in a perfect, immovable blonde bob. For years she had looked down on me from the high balcony of her inherited wealth. Even when my net worth had vastly surpassed hers, she never missed an opportunity to remind me that I was new money. I remembered Jasmine's wedding day. Diane had cornered me near the champagne fountain and loudly complimented my resilience in front of her country club friends while subtly mocking the rough neighborhood I grew up in. She loved to play the benevolent aristocrat dealing with the working class. Diane did not look angry as she stepped out of the car. She looked tired and immensely annoyed, like she was dealing with a stray dog that had wandered onto her manicured lawn. She told her driver to wait by the car, and she walked up to me, clutching a slim silver briefcase in her perfectly manicured hands. She looked me up and down, taking in my baggy gray prison sweatpants and my cheap canvas shoes. She sighed heavily, acting as if my very existence was a personal inconvenience to her Sunday afternoon schedule. She told me that I had made quite a scene in there. She said she supposed I felt very proud of myself for upsetting Jasmine and embarrassing Preston in front of the entire congregation. She spoke to me slowly, using that soft, condescending tone she always used when she wanted to put me in my place. She said she understood that I was angry. She said federal prison must have been a terribly traumatic experience for someone of my background. But she insisted that it was time for me to be realistic. She said Preston had built a legitimate empire now, and my presence in Atlanta was nothing but a toxic distraction to their family. Diane placed the silver briefcase on the hood of the Bentley and popped the latches. The lid flipped open, revealing neat, banded stacks of crisp $100 bills. She looked at me with cold, calculating eyes and told me there was $50,000 in cash sitting right there. She said it was completely untraceable. She told me it was more than enough money to buy a nice little house in a quiet neighborhood far away from the city. Then she leaned in slightly and dropped her polite mask, her voice hardened, dripping with centuries of unspoken prejudice. She told me that the problem with you people is that you never know when to walk away. She said I had my 15 minutes of fame in the corporate world, but it was over. She told me to take the money, go back to the ghetto, and leave her family alone before things got ugly. I stood there looking at the open briefcase. $50,000. It was a laughable amount. It was pocket change compared to the millions Preston had stolen from me. But to Diane, it was a fortune she assumed someone like me would be desperate to grab. She thought my poverty made me weak. She did not realize that having everything stripped away had actually made me dangerous. I had absolutely nothing left to lose, and she had an entire fake reputation to protect. I did not reach for the money. I did not even blink. I looked Diane straight in her pale blue eyes and told her to close the briefcase. I told her the humidity was going to ruin her crisp little bills. Diane frowned, clearly confused by my refusal. She started to say something else, probably another thinly veiled threat, but I cut her off. I asked Diane how the Sterling Family Foundation was doing these days. I watched her posture stiffen immediately. The foundation was her absolute pride and joy. She hosted lavish galas, raised millions for the arts, and plastered her family name on hospital wings across the state. I told her it was a beautiful charity on paper. I said it was truly inspiring how she managed to take in millions of dollars in anonymous donations every single quarter. I stepped closer to her, invading her personal space. I kept my voice low and steady. I told her that 5 years in a federal penitentiary is a very long time. I said you meet a lot of interesting people when you are locked up with the worst white-collar criminals in the country. I told her my cellmate for the last 3 years was a forensic accountant who used to wash money for the cartel before she got caught. I said we had a lot of free time to look over public tax records in the prison library. Diane took a step back, her confident, aristocratic demeanor starting to crack. Her hands tightened around the handle of her designer purse. I told her I knew the foundation was a massive fraud. I knew Preston was funneling his dirty real estate money through her charity disguised as anonymous donations to wash it clean before transferring it offshore to the Bahamas. I told her she was not a philanthropist. She was a common money launderer hiding behind a pearl necklace and a fake smile. Diane gasped, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. She told me I was insane. She said I had absolutely no proof of any of those ridiculous accusations and that her lawyers would bury me for slander. I reached into the pocket of my sweatpants and pulled out my cheap plastic burner phone. I looked down at the glowing screen where a draft email was already open and waiting. Attached to the email were high-resolution photographs of the unredacted bank logs Clarice had given me at the bank. The logs perfectly matched the exact dates and amounts of the anonymous donations deposited into Diane's charity. I told Diane she was about to find out exactly how much proof I had. I pressed the send button on the screen. I told her I just forwarded the entire encrypted file to the lead investigator at the Criminal Division of the IRS, along with a few investigative reporters at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Diane stared at me in absolute horror. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. 5 seconds passed, 10 seconds. Then suddenly the expensive smartphone inside Diane's designer purse began to ring. It was a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the quiet Sunday afternoon. She scrambled to pull the phone out, her perfect composure entirely shattered. She looked at the caller ID, and her hands began to shake violently. She answered the phone, pressing it to her ear. I watched as her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated panic. Even standing a few feet away, I could hear the frantic shouting of her wealth manager on the other end of the line. The IRS had just initiated an emergency freeze on all of the Sterling Family Foundation accounts. Federal agents were actively locking the glass doors to her charity headquarters downtown. Diane dropped her phone. It hit the concrete sidewalk, and the screen shattered into a spiderweb of cracked glass. She looked at me, breathing heavily, completely stripped of her arrogance and her unearned power. She no longer looked like an untouchable socialite. She looked like a terrified old woman who had just watched her entire legacy burn to the ground. I leaned in close until I was inches from her face. I whispered that I learned a lot about white-collar crime in prison, Diane. Tell your son he is next. I turned and walked away down the sidewalk, leaving the $50,000 sitting open on the hood of the Bentley and leaving Diane Sterling standing frozen in the wreckage of her ruined life. I walked away from Diane, leaving her to choke on the ashes of her fake charity. The afternoon sun was beginning to set over Atlanta, casting long golden shadows across the cracked pavement. I had a few dollars left in my pocket from the gate money they gave me at the prison, so I walked several blocks to the downtown public library. I needed a computer, and I needed a quiet place to think. I walked through the silent aisles, breathing in the familiar scent of old paper and dust. The contrast between my current situation and my past life was staggering. I used to sit in a sprawling corner office on the 50th floor, making multi-million-dollar decisions while looking out over the city skyline. Now I was sitting on a hard plastic chair in the back corner of a public library wearing gray sweatpants. But true power does not live in a corner office. It lives in the mind, and my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I sat down at the public terminal facing the wall so no one walking past could see my screen. Before I went to the charity gala to confront Jasmine, I had copied the bank logs Clarice gave me onto a small hidden flash drive. I plugged the drive into the cheap plastic tower and went to work. Preston was a very predictable man. He was driven entirely by his massive ego and his desperate need to prove he belonged in a world that only accepted his skin color but secretly laughed at his profound lack of actual business talent. His entire fraudulent empire was currently balanced on the edge of a very sharp knife. And that knife was a $50 million commercial project called the Azure Waterfront Resort. It was supposed to be a mega resort, a towering monument of glass and steel overlooking the river, featuring a casino, luxury spas, and 5-star dining. The tragic irony was that it was my original design. I bought that waterfront land 10 years ago. I drew up the initial concepts. When Preston stole my company, he took the resort project with him, claiming it as his own grand visionary idea. He staked his entire public reputation on its success. He promised his wealthy investors massive guaranteed returns. But Preston did not know how to actually build things. He only knew how to steal them and how to talk his way into elite social circles. As I scrolled through the unredacted bank logs on the library computer, the truth of his desperation became painfully clear. Building a $50 million resort requires massive amounts of liquid capital. But Preston had been siphoning millions of dollars offshore to his mistress and to his mother Diane to cover his earlier gambling losses and lifestyle expenses. He was bleeding money from the company accounts. To make up for the massive shortfall, he started cutting corners on the resort construction. He cut huge, terrifying corners that put innocent lives at risk. I opened a second browser window and pulled up the public building permits and inspection records from the city database. I compared his actual expenditures from the hidden bank logs with the public documents. The numbers did not match at all. He had purchased cheap, substandard steel for the load-bearing columns. He had skipped the mandatory environmental and soil testing for the massive concrete foundation. And right there, hidden deep in the ledger, was a recurring wire transfer to a shell company owned by the chief city building inspector. Preston had literally bribed the city to look the other way while he built a towering death trap on the river. I knew the head contractor hired for the project. His name was David Harrison. He was an honest, hard-working family man who had done several legitimate projects for me in the past before I was sent away. He had a spotless reputation in the state of Georgia, and he took immense pride in the safety of his construction crews. He would never knowingly build a compromised structure. Preston must have kept him entirely in the dark, feeding him forged safety reports and fake material invoices. I created an untraceable anonymous email account on the library server. I attached the encrypted bank transfers, the proof of the substandard steel purchases, and the explicit details of the bribes paid to the corrupt city inspector. I typed a brief message warning David that if the federal government found out about the structural flaws, he would lose his license and face severe criminal charges. I told him he was building a house of cards. I hit send. I logged out, wiped the browser history clean, and walked back out into the humid evening air, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I did not have to wait very long to see the explosive results of my work. The next afternoon, I was standing on the crowded sidewalk outside a large electronics store, watching the row of televisions displayed in the front window. The screens were tuned to the local financial news network. Around 2 o'clock, a bright red breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screens. Work on the Azure Waterfront Resort had been abruptly halted. A local news helicopter hovered high over the construction site, showing a chaotic scene. Hundreds of union workers were walking off the job, packing up their heavy tools, and driving away in their trucks. David Harrison had pulled his entire crew. He was not going to risk the lives of his men or his hard-earned reputation for a corrupt developer. The news anchor announced that an anonymous whistleblower had exposed massive structural code violations and that the city inspector was currently under federal investigation for accepting bribes. The financial fallout was immediate and absolutely catastrophic for my son-in-law. The stock market absolutely despises uncertainty, and rumors of a structural failure on a flagship $50 million project sent his investors into a blind panic. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the stock ticker running across the bottom of the television screen. The stock for the Sterling Holding Company began to freefall. It dropped 5% in the first hour. Then it dropped 10%. By the time the afternoon closing bell rang, his stock had plummeted a staggering 15%. Millions of dollars in imaginary wealth simply vanished into thin air. I knew exactly what was happening behind the closed doors of his corporate office. Institutional lenders were calling in their massive loans. Creditors were demanding immediate payment. Preston was suddenly drowning, and the cold water was rising incredibly fast. He was furious, cornered, and scrambling desperately for liquid cash to stop the bleeding and keep his fraudulent empire from collapsing overnight. I also knew exactly what a desperate man looked like, and I knew exactly who he would sacrifice to save himself. As I walked away from the electronics store, my cheap prepaid burner phone buzzed in my pocket. I answered it. It was Clarice the teller from the bank. Her voice was a hushed, frantic whisper. She told me I needed to know what was happening right now in the branch manager office. She said Preston had just dragged my daughter Jasmine into the bank lobby. His face was pale, he was sweating profusely, and his eyes were wild with panic. He had completely bypassed the teller line and marched straight into Richard, the branch manager glass office, locking the heavy door behind them. Clarice said she could hear Preston shouting through the thick glass. He was demanding the immediate liquidation of Jasmine Personal Trust Fund. It was a private account, set up by my late mother, meant only for Jasmine to use in the event of an absolute life-altering emergency. It contained the last $2 million of clean, untouched family money. Preston was forcing Jasmine to sign it all over to him so he could use it as collateral to pacify his angry lenders and keep the construction site from being permanently seized by the banks. Clarice described the heartbreaking scene unfolding before her eyes. Jasmine was sitting in the heavy leather chair, trembling. She was holding a solid gold pen hovering over a thick stack of irrevocable legal documents. Preston was leaning over her, his true, vicious nature fully exposed. He was no longer playing the role of the loving, supportive husband she thought she married. He was pressuring her relentlessly, telling her that if she did not sign, they would lose everything. He told her they would lose the penthouse, the luxury cars, and her precious country club memberships. He was actively manipulating her deep, shallow fear of poverty. Jasmine hesitated, her hand shaking uncontrollably. She looked at the legal papers and then looked up at the man she had betrayed her own mother for. In that exact moment, sitting in the cold bank office, my daughter finally realized the terrifying truth. She was not a respected partner in his grand empire. She was just another financial asset to be drained and discarded. She was sitting there holding the pen, realizing that she was about to sign her entire life and her only remaining safety net away to a man who would gladly leave her with absolutely nothing when the ship finally sank. The heavy air of the underground parking garage smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. I stood perfectly still in the deep shadows behind a massive support pillar, just waiting. It was past 9 o'clock at night. The dim fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the rows of luxury vehicles. I knew Jasmine routine perfectly. I knew she always parked her silver Mercedes in the VIP section right next to the private elevator that led up to her sprawling penthouse. I also knew she would be coming home late tonight, completely exhausted and emotionally drained from signing away her emergency trust fund to a man who was actively destroying her life. Sure enough, the heavy metal door to the elevator lobby clicked open. The sharp sound of Jasmine's expensive stiletto heels echoed off the concrete walls. I watched her walk toward her car. Her posture was completely different from the arrogant, confident woman who had stood on the stage at the charity gala just a few days ago. Her shoulders were slumped. She was clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest, and she looked nervously over her shoulder. She was beginning to feel the walls closing in around her. She reached into her purse to find her keys. The car chirped, unlocking the doors. That was my cue. I stepped out from behind the concrete pillar and walked slowly into the pale yellow light. Jasmine gasped, dropping her keys on the ground. She stumbled backward, pressing her back against the driver's side door of her Mercedes. Her eyes went wide with absolute panic when she recognized my face. She quickly tried to recover, putting on that same tough, haughty mask she always used when she wanted to intimidate people she thought were beneath her. She asked me what I was doing creeping around in the dark. Her voice was shaking, but she tried to make it sound sharp and commanding. She told me I was trespassing in a highly secure building. She called me a convicted felon and told me that if I did not leave immediately, she would hit the panic button on her key fob and have the police drag me right back to my prison cell. She said Preston had already warned me to stay away from them. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice or try to defend myself against her pathetic little threats. I simply walked closer, stopping just a few feet away from the hood of her car. I looked at the dark circles under her eyes and the tight tension in her jaw. She was terrified. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. I held it for a second, letting the silence stretch between us. Then I tossed it casually onto the pristine, polished hood of her expensive car. It landed with a heavy thud. I told her she was right about one thing. I was a felon. But I told her that very soon I was not going to be the only one in the family wearing a prison uniform. I nodded toward the folder and told her to open it. Jasmine crossed her arms, refusing to touch it. She told me she did not want to see any of my fabricated lies or crazy conspiracy theories. She said Preston had already warned her that I would try to drive a wedge between them. She said their marriage was completely solid and that they were a united front against my toxic jealousy. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. I told her to stop reciting the script Preston wrote for her. I told her she was a grown woman who had just signed away $2 million of her own grandmother money because her husband was too much of a coward to face his angry investors. I took a step closer, my voice dropping low and cold. I told her to open the folder unless she was too scared to see what she had actually sold her soul for. Jasmine swallowed hard. Her pride would not let her back down. With shaking hands, she reached out and picked up the manila folder. She flipped it open under the dim garage lights. The first thing she saw was a stack of high-definition photographs. They were pictures taken by the private investigator Clarice had recommended to me. The photos showed Preston sitting on the sun-drenched balcony of a luxury resort in the Bahamas, but he was not alone. Sitting on his lap, laughing and drinking champagne, was a 24-year-old blonde woman. The next photo showed them kissing on a private yacht. The next photo showed them walking hand in hand out of a high-end jewelry store holding bags from the exact same designer Jasmine loved so much. Beneath the photos were the printed offshore bank statements. They were the exact same statements Preston had used to drain the company accounts. But there was one crucial detail highlighted in bright yellow ink. The account was not a joint account. It did not have Jasmine's name anywhere on it. It was registered solely to Preston and to the young blonde woman in the photographs. Jasmine stopped breathing. Her eyes darted wildly across the photos and the bank numbers. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll. I watched the absolute devastation wash over her. I watched her perfectly constructed fake reality shatter into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. I looked at my daughter, the girl I had sacrificed my youth to protect. I felt no pity. I only felt a cold, absolute clarity. I told her, "He does not love you, Jasmine." I kept my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. I told her he loves the empire I built. He loves the money, the power, and the status. He used you to forge my signature, and he used you to take the fall. You are nothing but a human shield to him. And when this entire fraudulent empire finally burns to the ground, he is leaving you right here in the ashes. Jasmine stared at the papers. For a moment, I thought she was going to collapse, but then her profound denial kicked in. It was a survival mechanism. She could not accept that she had destroyed her own mother for a man who actually despised her. She started shaking her head violently. She screamed that it was a massive lie. She yelled that the photos were fake and photoshopped by a bitter old woman who could not stand to see her own daughter succeed. She said the bank statements were forged. She gripped the photographs in her hands and began tearing them apart. She ripped them over and over again until they were nothing but tiny shreds of glossy paper. She threw them onto the wet concrete floor of the garage, breathing heavily, her eyes wide and frantic. She told me to stay away from her family. She scrambled to pick up her keys, unlocked her car, and practically fell into the driver's seat. She slammed the door, locked it instantly, and started the engine. The powerful car roared to life, echoing loudly in the enclosed space. She put the car in reverse tires, squealing against the pavement, and sped out of the garage without looking back. I stood alone in the quiet garage, looking down at the torn pieces of the photographs scattered on the floor. I did not chase her. I did not need to. I knew my daughter better than she knew herself. She could tear up the pictures, but she could not tear the doubt out of her mind. The poison was already in her bloodstream. As Jasmine sped recklessly through the dark city streets, tears were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. She tried to convince herself that I was lying. She tried to tell herself that Preston loved her and that the money was safely stored away for their future just like he promised. But her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. She stopped at a red light, her heart pounding out of her chest. She reached over and tapped the touchscreen on her dashboard. Using her car's Bluetooth system, she dialed the international customer service number for the offshore bank in the Bahamas. It was the same number she had seen highlighted on the documents I gave her. The line rang 3 times before a polite representative answered. Jasmine tried to keep her voice steady. She gave the representative her name and asked to verify the balance on the private trust account Preston had set up last year. She provided her Social Security number and her home address. The representative put her on a brief hold. The silence in the car was absolutely deafening. Jasmine gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She prayed to God that I was wrong. She prayed that she was still a wealthy, respected wife. The representative came back on the line. The polite voice echoed through the car speakers, delivering the final crushing blow. The representative apologized and said there was no account under the name Jasmine Sterling. They informed her that she was not listed as an authorized user on any accounts associated with her husband. They politely suggested she speak directly with the primary account holder. The light turned green. Cars behind Jasmine began to honk their horns loudly, but she did not move. She sat frozen in the driver's seat, staring blankly at the empty road ahead. The reality of her situation finally crashed down upon her. She had absolutely nothing. No money, no husband, no mother, and no escape. She had signed her life away, and the man she did it for was already gone. I made it back to the cheap roadside motel just as the heavy Atlanta rain started to fall. The neon sign outside my window was buzzing loudly, casting a harsh, flickering red light across the wet pavement. I climbed the rusted metal stairs to the second floor, feeling the deep physical ache in my knees from walking miles in cheap canvas shoes. But inside my mind was humming with pure adrenaline. Jasmine was broken. The mega resort construction was completely paralyzed. Preston was bleeding cash and running out of places to hide. The grand, fraudulent empire he built on my name was crumbling exactly the way I had designed it to. As I walked down the open-air corridor and reached for the handle of room 212, I stopped. I noticed the cheap metal casing around the deadbolt was deeply scratched. The door was unlocked, resting just a fraction of an inch open. I did not panic. I did not turn around and run into the rainy night. I took a slow, deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The small, dingy room had been completely ransacked. The thin mattress was ripped off the bed frame and tossed aside. The drawers of the cheap particle board dresser were pulled out and thrown onto the stained carpet. My few items of clothing were scattered everywhere. Standing in the middle of the wreckage were 2 massive men. They did not look like standard street thugs or desperate robbers. They wore dark, unmarked tactical jackets and had the cold, dead eyes of men who hurt people for a living. Preston had finally panicked enough to hire professional muscle. The larger of the 2 men stepped forward, kicking the door shut behind me. He crossed his thick arms and stared down at me. He told me that my son-in-law was getting very tired of my little games. He demanded the flash drives, the bank statements, and the burner phone immediately. He said Preston was willing to let me walk away tonight with just a few broken ribs if I handed over the documents right now. But he warned me that if I refused to cooperate, they were going to tear the rest of the room apart with me in it. To demonstrate his point, the second man grabbed the cheap plastic television set from the top of the dresser. He lifted it high above his head and smashed it violently onto the floor. The heavy glass screen shattered with a deafening crash, sending sharp, jagged pieces flying across the room and bouncing off my canvas shoes. They looked at me, waiting for a reaction. They expected me to scream. They expected me to drop to my knees, cower in the corner, and beg for my life, just like the wealthy, soft people Preston usually bullied. They thought my gray prison sweatpants and my age made me an easy target. They did not understand that I had spent the last 5 years surviving in a federal penitentiary surrounded by women who were twice their size and 10 times more dangerous. I did not flinch. I did not even break eye contact with the large man standing near the door. I walked calmly past him, stepping carefully over the broken television glass, and went straight to the small bathroom sink. I picked up a flimsy plastic cup from the counter, turned on the squeaky faucet, and filled it with cold tap water. I took a slow, deliberate sip, leaning casually against the bathroom doorframe. I looked at the 2 men and told them they were working for a coward. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of fear. I said Preston sent them here tonight because he was too scared to face me himself. I asked them how much he was paying them to intimidate an old woman in a rundown motel room. I told them whatever the amount was, it was not nearly enough to cover the massive legal fees they were about to need. The big man let out a harsh, grating laugh. He took a heavy step toward me, pulling a thick steel baton from his tactical belt. He slapped the baton against his open palm. He told me I watched too many movies and that it was time for me to stop talking and start handing over the evidence. He said they were not going to leave empty-handed, and he did not care if he had to break every bone in my body to find what he was looking for. I took another sip of my water. I told him he was making a terrible mistake trusting a man like Preston Sterling. I asked the two men if they honestly believed a wealthy, arrogant white real estate developer from the high society suburbs was going to pay their bail when the federal government charged them with racketeering. I told them Preston was leaving a massive paper trail, and when the walls finally closed in, he was going to deny he ever met them. I said they were nothing but expendable pawns to him. The second man scoffed and told his partner to just grab me and get it over with. I looked down at the cheap plastic digital watch on my wrist. I told them they had exactly 30 seconds to walk out of that door before their lives were permanently ruined. I explained that Preston did not just send them to rob a motel room, he sent them to assault a highly protected federal asset. The two men looked at each other and laughed even harder. The sound of their amusement echoed in the small, trashed room. They thought I was a delusional old woman desperately bluffing to save her own skin. They thought my threat was completely empty. The big man raised his steel baton and took another aggressive step forward, closing the distance between us. He did not get to take a third step. The sudden deafening wail of multiple police sirens shattered the quiet, rainy night. The noise was incredibly loud, coming from every direction at once. Before the two men could even process the sound, the harsh, piercing glare of flashing red and blue lights sliced through the thin motel blinds, illuminating the absolute terror that suddenly washed over their faces. They froze, completely paralyzed. The heavy steel baton dropped from the big man hand, hitting the carpet with a dull thud. The second man rushed to the window and pulled back a slat in the blinds. He let out a string of panicked curses. Half a dozen black federal SUVs and marked police cruisers were swarming the motel parking lot, blocking every possible exit and flooding the second-floor balcony with high-powered searchlights. The two tough professional enforcers were suddenly scrambling like terrified children looking for a way out that did not exist. I reached into the pocket of my gray sweatpants and pulled out my cheap prepaid burner phone. I dialed a saved number and held the phone to my ear, watching the men pace back and forth in sheer panic. The line clicked open instantly. I spoke clearly and calmly into the receiver. I said, "Agent Davis, it is Vivian. Preston is getting incredibly sloppy, and he just sent two of his amateur friends to tear apart my room." I smiled as the sound of heavy tactical boots began pounding up the metal stairs outside my door. I looked at the two men who were now raising their hands in surrender before the door was even breached. I spoke into the phone one last time. I told the federal agent, "It is time to escalate." The morning after the feds arrested Preston thugs, the air in Atlanta felt lighter. I was sitting in my motel room drinking cheap instant coffee and looking at my new prepaid phone. I knew exactly what Preston was doing at that very moment. He was cornered. His stock was in free fall, and his mega resort project was completely frozen. His only way out was to liquidate the core assets of the company to pay off his massive debts. But he had a problem. When he stole my company 5 years ago, he could not completely erase me. I still technically held 5% of the original founding shares. They were ghost shares sitting dormant in a holding trust, but they gave me a minority voting right. Preston needed total unanimous consent to sell off the commercial real estate divisions. He needed to dilute my shares to 0. He called an emergency board meeting for 10 o'clock that morning. He gathered all the wealthy investors and board members in the grand mahogany boardroom on the top floor of the corporate tower. It was the same tower I designed and built. I knew he would try to fast-track a vote to issue 1 million new phantom shares, effectively reducing my ownership to a fraction of a percent and wiping me off the board entirely. He thought I was too broke and too distracted to stop him. He was wrong. I did not go to the building myself. I did not need to. I had something much more effective. I had hired a young, brilliant corporate attorney named Chloe. Chloe was a sharp, fiercely intelligent African-American woman who had graduated at the top of her class from Harvard Law. She grew up in my old neighborhood, and she remembered the scholarships my foundation used to give out before Preston destroyed it. She was hungry, she was ruthless, and she absolutely despised men like Preston Sterling. We had spent the entire night going over the original corporate bylaws I wrote 20 years ago. We found the exact weapon we needed. Chloe walked into the grand lobby of the Sterling building wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying a heavy leather briefcase. She bypassed the reception desk completely. When the security guards tried to stop her, she handed them a federal injunction printed on thick legal paper that forced them to step aside. She stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the 50th floor. I was on the phone with her the entire time listening through the earpiece. The connection was perfectly clear. Up in the boardroom, Preston was sweating. I could hear the nervous tremor in his voice as he addressed the board of directors. He was trying to sound like the confident, visionary leader he always pretended to be. He told the board that the recent construction delays on the resort were just temporary setbacks caused by a few disgruntled contractors. He lied smoothly, telling them he had a massive buyer lined up for the downtown retail properties that would inject $50 million of fresh liquid capital into their accounts. He just needed the board to vote on the emergency dilution of the founding shares to clear the red tape. Several of the older conservative investors murmured in agreement. They were greedy men who only cared about their quarterly dividends. They did not care about me or how Preston had stolen the company. They just wanted their money. Preston asked the board secretary to record the motion. He asked for all those in favor to raise their hands. That was the exact moment Chloe reached the boardroom. She did not knock. She did not wait to be announced. She raised her foot and kicked the heavy double doors open with so much force they slammed against the interior walls. The loud crack echoed through the massive room, silencing the entire board instantly. Chloe walked straight to the head of the long mahogany table. She did not look at the investors. She locked her eyes directly on Preston. He was standing at the head of the table, his face turning pale with shock and sudden anger. He demanded to know who she was and how she got past his security. He yelled at her that this was a closed executive meeting and threatened to have her arrested for trespassing. Chloe did not even blink. She calmly opened her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She dropped them directly onto the polished wood table right in front of Preston. She spoke in a clear, powerful voice that commanded the entire room. She introduced herself as the primary legal counsel representing Vivian Ross, the original founder and controlling minority shareholder of the company. Preston laughed nervously, looking around at the board members trying to make a joke out of the situation. He told Chloe that Vivian was a convicted felon who held no real power in the building anymore. He said they were literally seconds away from voting her ghost shares out of existence, so Chloe had wasted a trip. Chloe smiled. It was a sharp, dangerous smile. She told Preston that there was going to be no vote today. She told him there was going to be no dilution of shares and absolutely no liquidation of company assets. Preston's face turned bright red. He slammed his hand on the table and yelled at her to get out of his boardroom. Chloe ignored his childish tantrum. She turned to address the board members directly. She told them to turn to page 47 of the original corporate bylaws. The same bylaws I had drafted by hand 20 years ago when I first incorporated the business. She recited the clause from memory. It was an obscure little paragraph known as a founder veto. It stated very clearly that if the total market valuation of the company dropped by more than 10% in a single fiscal quarter, no founding shares could be diluted, and no core assets could be liquidated without the physical notarized signature of the original founding party. Chloe reminded the board that thanks to the disaster at the mega resort, the company's stock had plummeted 15% just yesterday. The condition for the founder veto was officially triggered. I had total veto power over any financial restructuring, and I was never going to sign a single piece of paper for Preston Sterling. The boardroom erupted into chaos. The wealthy investors began frantically flipping through their thick legal binders. They found the clause exactly where Chloe said it would be. They started shouting questions at Preston, demanding to know why his expensive corporate lawyers had not caught this loophole. They realized immediately that their money was trapped in a sinking ship, and Preston had absolutely no legal authority to save them. Preston tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the angry investors. He looked down at the documents Chloe had dropped on the table. The reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on high-priced legal teams to steal my company, but he had been outsmarted by a clause I wrote 2 decades ago sitting at my kitchen table. The panic finally broke him. The charming, sophisticated mask he wore for high society completely shattered. Preston grabbed the heavy crystal water glass sitting on the table in front of him. He let out a primal, furious scream and hurled the glass across the room. It smashed violently against the expensive mahogany wall paneling, shattering into hundreds of sharp pieces that rained down onto the carpet. The entire boardroom went dead silent. The investors stared at Preston in absolute horror. These were men of quiet, calculated wealth. They despised public outbursts and emotional instability. In that one single moment, they saw the real Preston Sterling. They saw a frantic, unhinged fraud who had completely lost control of his company and his mind. The oldest and wealthiest investor at the table, a man who had backed Preston from the very beginning, slowly stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket and looked at Preston with pure disgust. He said he was pulling his private funding immediately. He said he would not leave his money in the hands of a violent, erratic child who did not even read his own corporate bylaws. One by one, the other board members began packing up their briefcases. They stood up and walked out of the boardroom, leaving Preston standing alone at the head of the table, breathing heavily, surrounded by broken glass and ruined plans. Chloe did not say another word. She calmly closed her briefcase, turned around, and walked out the door, leaving the doors wide open behind her. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and spoke softly into her phone. She told me the job was done and that the investors were running for the exits. I sat on the edge of my cheap motel bed, listening to the glorious sound of his empire collapsing. I took a sip of my instant coffee. It tasted better than the most expensive champagne in the world. Preston thought he could erase me from the board, but I had just locked the doors and thrown away the key. He was trapped inside a burning building of his own making, and there was absolutely no one left to save him. I was not in the penthouse that evening when my daughter finally confronted her husband, but I did not need to be there to know exactly how the brutal scene unfolded. Jasmine told me every single agonizing detail later, when she was sitting on the floor weeping until she had no tears left. As the storm clouds gathered over the glittering Atlanta skyline, Jasmine was pacing the imported hardwood floors of their massive living room. She had been waiting for hours ever since she made that devastating phone call to the offshore bank. The shredded pieces of the photographs I gave her in the parking garage were still burning in her mind. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy life was completely shattering, but she was desperately clinging to the last few pathetic pieces of hope. She prayed that Preston would walk through the door and explain it all away. She wanted to believe her mother was simply a vindictive liar trying to ruin her happiness. When the private elevator finally chimed and the heavy mahogany doors slid open, Preston did not walk in looking like the confident, charming gentleman she had married. He stormed into the penthouse looking like a wild, trapped animal. His expensive designer tie was ripped open, and his tailored suit jacket was crumpled and stained with sweat. He had just come straight from the disastrous board meeting where my lawyer Chloe had completely humiliated him and legally locked away his remaining corporate assets. He was cornered broke and absolutely furious. Jasmine was so consumed by her own panic that she did not even notice his desperate, erratic state. She walked right up to him, her voice trembling, and demanded to know where their money was. She asked him about the offshore account in the Bahamas. She asked him who the young blonde woman in the photographs was, and why her own name was not on the trust fund he had just forced her to sign over that afternoon. She expected him to immediately apologize, or to lie smoothly the way he always did when he was caught. She expected him to hold her tightly and tell her that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But Preston did not try to comfort her. He did not even try to deny a single word. He looked at my daughter with a cold, dead expression and let out a harsh, bitter laugh. The cruel sound echoed through the massive, empty penthouse, bouncing off the floor to ceiling windows. He walked right past her, ignoring her completely. He went straight to the crystal liquor cabinet, poured himself a heavy glass of expensive bourbon, and swallowed it in one aggressive gulp. Jasmine followed him, her anger finally breaking through her crippling fear. She yelled at him. She told him she was his wife, and she demanded his respect. She reminded him that she had given up everything for him and that she deserved the absolute truth about the mistress and the millions of dollars he had stolen from her family. Preston slowly put the heavy crystal glass down on the marble counter. He turned around to face her. In that moment, all the fake Southern charm and polite high society manners completely melted away, revealing the ugly, cruel, manipulative man he truly was underneath the expensive suits. He told Jasmine to shut her mouth and lower her voice. He said she did not deserve anything except a massive reality check. He told her the money was entirely gone and it was never actually hers to begin with. He said the blonde woman in the Bahamas was the woman he actually planned to spend his life with once the dust settled. He looked Jasmine right in the eyes and told her she was nothing but a temporary business transaction. Jasmine completely lost her mind. The betrayal cut so deep, it broke something inside her. She raised her hand and tried to slap him across the face, screaming that she hated him and calling him a monster. But Preston was faster. He caught her wrist mid-air, gripping her arm so viciously tight she gasped in pain. And then, with his free hand, he slapped my daughter straight across the face. The strike was incredibly hard and violent. It echoed like a gunshot in the quiet, luxurious room. Jasmine stumbled backward, completely stunned, the side of her face burning a bright, painful red. She lost her footing and fell hard onto the expensive white leather sofa, looking up at the man she loved in absolute sheer horror. She had never seen him become physical before. Preston stood over her, his chest heaving with rage. He did not look sorry. He looked entirely triumphant. He pointed his finger at her and called her a spoiled, gullible idiot. He told her she was the easiest mark he had ever met in his entire pathetic life. He asked her if she honestly believed he had married her because he found her intelligent or beautiful. He laughed again, a cruel, punishing sound that made Jasmine shrink back against the cushions. He told her he only married her because she was Vivian Ross' daughter, and she was completely blinded by her own massive greed. He told her he knew exactly how deeply insecure she was. He knew she was utterly desperate for validation from the white elite high society circles that would always secretly look down on her no matter how much money she spent. He told her she was so eager to fit into his privileged world that she never even bothered to read the legal documents he constantly put in front of her. He confessed everything right there standing over her in the living room. He told her he had carefully orchestrated the entire federal fraud case against me, and he had deliberately used her to do the dirty work. He said he set the complex legal traps and simply handed her the pen. He manipulated her deep-seated jealousy and resentment, convincing her that I was holding her back from her true potential as a high society wife. He told her he knew without a doubt that she would eagerly betray her own mother just to secure her permanent spot at the exclusive country club. He said she was a willing accomplice to her own destruction because she cared more about wearing designer dresses and drinking imported champagne than she cared about the woman who scrubbed floors to feed her. Jasmine sat on the sofa, sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her stinging cheek. The absolute brutal truth was completely suffocating her, crushing her chest. She realized in that exact agonizing moment that she had destroyed the only person in the entire world who had ever truly loved her unconditionally, just to impress a man who viewed her as nothing more than a disposable tool. Preston did not give her a single moment to process the immense grief. He walked over to the heavy front door and opened it wide. He looked back at Jasmine and told her to get out of his house. Jasmine stared at him through her blurry tears, completely confused by the sudden command. She told him this was her home. She said her clothes and her jewelry were here, and she was not leaving her own penthouse. Preston smiled a cold, dead, empty smile. He informed her that the penthouse was never actually in her name. It was legally owned by a subsidiary of his private holding company, the exact same company that was currently drowning in federal investigations and debt. He told her that since she had foolishly signed away her grandmother emergency trust fund just a few hours earlier, she literally had absolutely nothing left to her name. She had no bank accounts, no property, no credit cards, and certainly no husband. He walked over to the sofa, grabbed Jasmine by the arm, and roughly pulled her to her feet. He dragged her across the polished living room floor while she cried and desperately begged him to stop. She pleaded with him, telling him she had nowhere to go and no money for a hotel room. She reminded him that it was pouring rain outside. Preston did not care at all. He dragged her out into the private elevator lobby. He looked at her perfectly styled hair and her tear-stained face and told her she was finally going back to the exact place she belonged. He pushed her forcefully into the elevator and reached in to press the lobby button. He told her if she ever tried to come back to the building, he would have building security arrest her for trespassing. He said he was entirely done playing house with her, and he never wanted to see her face again. The heavy metal doors of the elevator slid shut, leaving Jasmine entirely alone in the small, confined space. She rode the elevator down 50 floors, her entire universe completely shattered. When she stumbled out into the grand lobby, the security guards who used to bow to her simply watched her with cold, indifferent eyes. Preston had already called down and revoked her building access. My daughter walked out the heavy glass doors of the luxury high-rise and stepped out onto the cold, dark streets of downtown Atlanta. It was raining heavily now, the freezing water soaking instantly through her expensive silk blouse and ruining her designer shoes. She had no purse, no phone charger, no car keys, and absolutely no shelter. The golden child, the supposed savior of the corporate empire, was completely homeless. She stood on the street corner, shivering uncontrollably in the rain, looking up at the glowing lights of the penthouse she used to rule, realizing she had permanently thrown away her soul for a kingdom made of sand. The heavy Atlanta rain continued to fall relentlessly against the thin glass of my motel window. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress listening to the storm rage outside. The cheap digital clock on the nightstand glowed a bright red, showing it was well past midnight. My mind was still sharp and fully awake, playing through the events of the day. The corporate boardroom was secure. Preston was bleeding out financially. I knew the fallout of his ruined empire was happening somewhere in the dark city, but I did not expect the wreckage to arrive directly at my front door. Then I heard it. A soft, hesitant knock against the cheap metal door. It was followed by a louder, more desperate pounding. Someone was out there, standing in the freezing rain. I stood up, my body aching slightly from the cold, damp air that seeped through the floorboards. I walked slowly to the door and pressed my eye against the scratched peephole. Standing under the flickering neon light, shivering uncontrollably, was my daughter. Jasmine looked absolutely nothing like the elegant, poised woman who had stood on the charity gala stage just a few days ago. Her expensive silk blouse was completely soaked, clinging tightly to her skin. Her perfect hair was plastered to her face in wet, tangled strands. She was not wearing her designer heels. She was standing barefoot on the wet concrete, holding her ruined shoes in one hand. But what caught my attention immediately was the dark purple swelling forming high on her left cheekbone. It was the undeniable mark of a violent physical slap. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open just a few inches, keeping my body firmly positioned in the gap. Jasmine gasped when she saw my face. She practically collapsed against the doorframe, sobbing heavily. She looked at me with wild, terrified eyes and began begging instantly. She said, "Mom, please let me in." She told me I was right about everything from the very beginning. She said Preston threw her out of the penthouse. She told me he took all the money and left her with absolutely nothing to her name. She pointed a trembling finger to her bruised face and cried, telling me he hit her when she finally confronted him about the young blonde mistress and the offshore bank accounts. She begged me to save her. She begged me to hold her and tell her everything was going to be all right. She asked me to please let her come inside out of the cold, freezing rain so we could figure out how to fix this massive nightmare together. She was completely reverting to a frightened, helpless child, expecting her mother to instantly drop everything and shield her from the brutal consequences of her own terrible actions. For a fraction of a second, a deep, primal instinct flared in my chest. It was the old, familiar maternal urge to pull my injured child inside, to wrap her in a warm, dry towel and wipe the bitter tears from her face. It was the exact same instinct that had driven me to scrub hotel floors for decades just to keep her safe and comfortable. But that weak instinct died the very moment I looked deeply into her panicked eyes and remembered the cold, sterile atmosphere of the federal courtroom 5 years ago. I did not step aside to let her in. I stood perfectly still, blocking the narrow doorway like a solid wall of brick and ice. I looked at her bruised face, her ruined designer clothes, and her desperate tears. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of pity. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying calm that cut straight through the sound of the pouring rain. I told her to stop crying. I told her these tears were exactly 5 years too late. Jasmine stopped talking, her breath hitching in her throat as she stared at my cold expression. I reminded her of the specific morning she took the witness stand in federal court. I described exactly what she wore that day. It was a crisp, white, tailored suit bought with the money I had earned. I reminded her how perfectly calm and steady her voice was when she placed her hand on the Bible and swore an oath to tell the whole truth. I told her that when she testified under oath that I had embezzled those millions of dollars, she looked me dead in the eye and she did not shed a single tear. I reminded her that she did not tremble or beg for forgiveness when she handed the prosecuting attorney the forged documents. She sat there looking like a perfect, innocent angel while she actively drove the final nail into my coffin. She watched the judge sentence me to a concrete cell, and she walked out of that courtroom with her head held high, completely ready to take over my empire and play the role of the tragic heroine. Jasmine shook her head desperately, pleading with me again. She told me Preston forced her to do it. She said he manipulated her and threatened to leave her if she did not follow his exact plan. She cried harder, saying she was young and scared and did not know how to stop him. I told her no one forces a grown woman to systematically destroy her own mother. I told her she did it because she was incredibly greedy and profoundly weak. I told her she was so desperate for high society approval and so terrified of losing her precious luxury lifestyle that she willingly traded my freedom for a penthouse and a country club membership. I told her she wanted the corporate crown so badly she was perfectly willing to step directly on my neck to reach it. I looked at her ruined, miserable state, standing barefoot and bruised in the freezing rain. I kept my voice completely devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. I told her, "You wanted the crown, Jasmine, now you have to wear it." Jasmine reached her hand out, grasping frantically at the edge of the wooden door frame. She screamed for me not to leave her out there in the dark. She told me I was her mother, and I was supposed to love her no matter what she did. She said I could not just turn my back on my own flesh and blood when she was hurting and had nowhere else to go. I looked at her one last time, completely and permanently severing the invisible toxic cord that had tied my heart to hers for her entire life. I told her blood does not make you family, and loyalty is not something you can steal. I told her she was no longer my daughter. She was just another woman who made a terrible business decision and now had to pay the ultimate price. I stepped back into the dim, quiet motel room. I pushed the heavy metal door completely shut, forcing her hand off the frame. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly into place, echoing like a gunshot in the small space. I stood silently just inside the room, listening to my daughter sobbing hysterically, sliding down the other side of the wet door until she was sitting on the concrete walkway. She pounded her fists against the metal, begging me to open it, begging me to save her just one last time. But I did not reach for the handle. The sacrificing scapegoat mother was officially dead and buried. I turned off the red neon light, walked over to the lumpy mattress, and went to sleep while the rain washed away the last traces of my past. I woke up the next morning to the sound of the rain finally stopping. The air outside the motel room was thick and muggy, but the cold reality of the day was already setting in. I walked over to the small broken television set sitting on the floor. I plugged the cord into the wall and turned the dial to the local news channel. I knew Preston was not just going to sit quietly and watch his life fall apart. A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind of animal, and Preston was completely backed into a very dark corner. He had lost his investors, his wife, and his dignity, all in the span of a few days. The television screen flickered to life, and there he was. He had hired a high-priced public relations firm overnight. He was standing on the wide marble steps of the county courthouse, wearing a dark, somber suit looking directly into the flashing cameras of the local press. He was playing the victim perfectly. He released a formal, prepared statement claiming that a disgruntled, convicted felon was actively trying to extort his legitimate business. He did not say my name out loud, but he did not have to. Everyone in the Atlanta business world knew exactly who he was talking about. He spun a massive, complex web of lies, telling the reporters that this mysterious ex-convict was using fabricated documents to terrorize his family and sabotage the local economy. He claimed the sudden halt on the mega resort construction was simply a temporary safety review caused by malicious anonymous tips. He looked at the cameras with fake tears in his eyes and asked the public to pray for his family during this difficult time. He was desperately trying to control the narrative. He was trying to paint me as a crazy, vindictive old woman who had completely lost her mind in federal prison and was now obsessively stalking her successful son-in-law. Watching him lie on live television did not make me angry. It just confirmed exactly how predictable and pathetic he was. He was fighting a war of public perception because it was the only weapon he had left. But Preston was not just fighting a public relations battle in front of the cameras. Behind closed doors, he was using his last remaining drops of political capital to silence me permanently. I knew he had powerful friends in high places. When I was running the corporate empire, I was the one who introduced him to the local politicians and the city judges. I knew exactly who he had been quietly paying off over the last 5 years. He had reached out to a deeply corrupt circuit court judge named Thomas Caldwell. Preston had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into the re-election campaign for Judge Caldwell through his fake charity foundation. In exchange for one last desperate favor, the judge quietly signed an emergency bench warrant for my immediate arrest. The charge was aggravated harassment and attempted corporate extortion. Preston knew perfectly well that with my previous criminal record, a brand new felony charge would violate my parole instantly. He did not just want to scare me. He wanted me dragged out of the cheap motel in heavy iron handcuffs. He wanted me thrown into a maximum security holding cell without any chance of bail before I could release any more of his dirty financial secrets to the federal authorities or the press. He wanted to lock me away in the dark where no one would ever listen to me again. He thought if he could just put me back in a cage, his problems would magically disappear. But Preston made one fatal miscalculation. He thought I was sitting in my run-down room, terrified and blindly waiting for his next move. He forgot that I had spent 60 months learning exactly how the criminal justice system moves and breathes. I knew the arrest warrant was coming before the ink on the signature of the judge was even dry. My brilliant lawyer Chloe had a trusted clerk at the courthouse keeping a close eye on the daily docket. She called my prepaid burner phone just after dawn and told me the local police tactical units were already mobilizing. I did not panic. I did not rush or make any sudden mistakes. I calmly packed my single change of clothes, my toothbrush, and my encrypted flash drives into a small plastic grocery bag. I took a damp towel and carefully wiped down every single surface in the room to leave absolutely no physical trace of my presence. I walked out the heavy metal door and down the rusted stairs long before the distant wail of police sirens ever broke the quiet morning silence. I walked 3 blocks through the damp city streets to a busy central bus station and bought a ticket with the last bit of cash I had. I sat in the very back row of the bus, pulling my jacket tight around my shoulders. As the heavy city transit bus pulled away from the curb, I looked out the smeared glass window and watched 4 marked police cruisers skid aggressively into the motel parking lot. Heavily armed tactical officers jumped out of their vehicles and rushed up the exterior stairs with their weapons drawn, ready to kick down the door of room 212. They were expecting to find a dangerous criminal mastermind. Instead, they were going to find an empty room, a broken television, and a ghost. I rode the bus for 2 quiet hours, heading far outside the bustling city limits of Atlanta into a sleepy neighboring town. The landscape outside the window slowly changed from towering glass skyscrapers and crowded highways to small brick storefronts and quiet tree-lined suburban streets. I got off the bus at the final stop and walked down a quiet residential avenue until I reached an old, imposing stone building. It was a private, secure vault facility that had been operating quietly since the early 1970s. It was entirely disconnected from the modern digital banking system. There were no online records, no digital footprints, and no corporate oversight. Absolutely no one knew I had an account here. Not my daughter Jasmine, not my enemies, and certainly not the federal prosecutors, who had seized all my known corporate assets 5 years ago. I had set this up decades ago for a moment exactly like this. I walked through the heavy brass double doors and approached the elderly clerk sitting behind the polished wooden counter. I reached into my pocket and handed him a small silver key I had kept completely hidden inside the lining of my shoe for 5 long, miserable years in prison. The clerk did not ask any questions. He checked my signature against an old dusty paper card, led me down a dimly lit corridor, and unlocked a massive steel door leading deep into the underground vault. He left me alone in the quiet, dust-filled room. The air smelled of old paper and stale metal. I walked slowly down the long rows of identical silver boxes until I found mine located in the far back corner. I turned my key in the lock and pulled the long, heavy metal drawer out. The box was completely empty, except for one single item resting flat on the bottom. It was a massive, thick, yellowed manila envelope. The edges of the paper were frayed and covered in a very fine layer of dust from years of sitting untouched in the dark. Written across the front of the envelope in thick, faded black marker were 3 simple letters: DNR, do not reveal. I reached into the box and picked up the envelope, feeling the heavy, substantial weight of the ancient documents inside. I ran my thumb over the thick paper. Preston thought he had seen my worst. He thought the offshore bank accounts, the structural bribes, and the boardroom takeover were my only weapons. He thought a fake public relations campaign and a corrupt judge could save his stolen empire. He had absolutely no idea that I had buried his biggest and darkest secret 20 years ago, when he was just a young, arrogant broker trying to make a name for himself. He thought the past was completely dead. But as I held the heavy envelope in my hand, standing alone in the quiet vault, I knew the absolute truth. The past never truly dies, and it was finally time to dig it up and let it destroy him. After leaving the underground vault, I took the long bus ride back toward the city. The heavy, yellowed envelope felt like a brick resting safely in my lap. I did not go back to the motel, and I certainly did not go anywhere near the corporate district. I got off the bus a few miles outside the city limits and walked into a small, rundown diner that sat right on the edge of the interstate highway. It was the kind of place that smelled of burnt bacon and stale coffee. It was the kind of place where truck drivers and tired travelers stopped to eat in absolute silence, avoiding eye contact with everyone around them. I slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the far back corner, facing the front glass doors. I ordered a simple cup of black coffee from a waitress who looked just as exhausted as the building itself. I sat quietly watching the rain-soaked highway. I knew my brief time in hiding was coming to a rapid end. The pieces were all firmly in place, and the board was completely set for the final devastating move. I sat there for nearly 2 hours watching the gray afternoon sky slowly darken into evening outside the streaked diner windows. I was not surprised at all when a sleek black town car suddenly pulled off the highway and parked roughly over 2 spots in the empty gravel lot. Preston had spared absolutely no expense trying to find me. He must have had his private security team tracking traffic cameras and bus routes ever since the tactical police units failed to arrest me at the motel that morning. The small bell above the glass door jingled loudly, cutting through the quiet hum of the diner refrigerators. Preston walked in. He looked absolutely terrible. The perfectly styled hair and the charming Southern gentleman's smile were completely gone. He was wearing an incredibly expensive dark charcoal suit, but the fabric was deeply wrinkled, and his silk tie was hanging loose around his neck. He had dark, heavy bags under his eyes, and his skin was a sickly pale color. He looked exactly like a man who had not slept in days. He looked around the small, dingy diner, his eyes frantically scanning the empty booths, until they finally locked onto me sitting in the shadows of the back corner. He took a deep, trembling breath, puffed out his chest, trying to summon whatever fake authority he had left, and walked quickly over to my table. He did not wait for an invitation. He slid heavily into the vinyl booth directly across from me. He folded his hands tightly on top of the sticky Formica table and stared at me. I did not move. I did not reach for my coffee or acknowledge him in any physical way. I just looked back at him, perfectly content to wait for him to make his desperate play. He reached into the inside pocket of his ruined suit jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. He slid it slowly across the table until it rested right next to my coffee cup. He kept his hand resting heavily on top of it, tapping his fingers nervously against the paper. He told me he was tired of playing these destructive games. He said the last few days had been a complete nightmare for everyone involved, and it was time to finally put an end to the madness before someone got seriously hurt. He tried to make his voice sound smooth and reasonable, like a seasoned businessman negotiating a fair trade, but I could hear the absolute sheer terror vibrating deep in his chest. I asked him quietly what was inside the envelope. He told me it was a one-way first-class private jet ticket to Jamaica, departing at midnight tonight from a private airfield just outside the city. He said he had also included a certified cashier check for $1 million, drawn from a completely clean, untraceable corporate account. He looked at me with wild, pleading eyes. He told me it was more than enough money to live like an absolute queen on a beautiful tropical beach for the rest of my natural life. He said all I had to do was take the envelope, walk out of the diner, get on that plane, and disappear forever. He promised that if I left tonight, he would immediately call off the corrupt judge, he would drop the felony arrest warrants, and he would never, ever look for me again. I looked down at the white envelope and then back up at the man who had stolen my entire life. $1 million. It was a pathetic, desperate bribe. He had stolen hundreds of millions of dollars from my corporate accounts over the years, and now he was trying to buy his own salvation with the absolute bare minimum. He needed me gone immediately because tomorrow was the most important day of his entire fraudulent career. Tomorrow was the grand opening of the Azure Waterfront Resort. I knew exactly why the resort opening was so incredibly critical to his basic survival. Since I had legally locked down the boardroom and his local wealthy investors had completely abandoned him, his only remaining hope was securing massive amounts of foreign capital. He had invited hundreds of wealthy international investors, local politicians, and national media outlets to the grand ribbon-cutting ceremony tomorrow morning. He desperately needed to project an image of absolute perfection and unstoppable success to convince those foreign investors to dump their money into his failing empire. If he could secure their investments tomorrow, he could pay off his massive debts and escape the federal authorities. But if I showed up and exposed his crimes in front of the international press, his entire world would collapse instantly and permanently. I told Preston that $1 million was a very generous offer, coming from a man who was currently drowning in insurmountable debt. I told him he should probably save that money to pay the high-priced criminal defense attorneys he was going to desperately need by the end of the week. Preston's face hardened instantly. The fake diplomatic smile vanished completely, replaced by a dark, vicious scowl. He leaned across the small table, invading my personal space. The strong smell of stale alcohol and expensive cologne washed over me. He lowered his voice to a dangerous, raspy whisper. He told me I was completely out of options. He said I was an arrogant, stubborn old woman who did not understand the very dangerous people he was currently dealing with. He explained that the money he borrowed to build the luxury resort did not just come from traditional banks and wealthy friends. He had taken massive short-term loans from very quiet, very violent organizations that did not care about corporate bylaws or courtroom drama. He said those people were expecting a massive return on their investment tomorrow afternoon, and they do not accept apologies. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He told me that if I did not take the ticket and get on that plane tonight, I was going to severely regret it for the very brief remainder of my life. He promised me that if I dared to show my face at the grand opening of his mega resort tomorrow morning, he would not just call the police to have me arrested. He swore he would have me permanently taken care of before I could even open my mouth to speak. He told me he would have his associates drag me into an alley, and I would simply disappear off the face of the earth, and absolutely no one would ever care enough to come looking for me. He sat back heavily in the booth, breathing hard, completely exhausted by his own violent threats. He truly thought he had finally won. He thought the explicit threat of actual death would be the thing that finally broke my spirit and sent me running blindly into the dark. I sat perfectly still. I did not flinch. I did not look nervously at the door or show a single ounce of the fear he so desperately wanted to see. I reached out and calmly picked up my heavy ceramic mug. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, letting the bitter, warm liquid wash down my throat. I set the mug down gently on the table, not spilling a single drop. I looked Preston directly in his bloodshot eyes. I smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm smile, the kind of absolute cold smile that makes a predator realize they are actually the prey. I reached across the table and pushed the white envelope back toward him. I told him to keep his ticket, Preston. I kept my voice completely level, speaking with absolute icy authority. I told him I had already RSVP'd to the party. Preston stared at me, his jaw clenching in absolute sheer disbelief. His mind could not comprehend that I was completely unafraid of him. I slid out of the cracked vinyl booth, standing up to my full height and looking down at him. I held my heavy yellowed envelope tightly against my side. I looked at his ruined suit and told him to make sure he wears a suit that looks good in mugshots. I told him the cameras are going to be everywhere tomorrow, and he was going to want to look his best for the federal agents. I turned my back on him and walked straight out of the diner into the cool evening air, leaving him sitting entirely alone in the dark booth, staring at his worthless bribe. The storm was finally here, and I was bringing it straight to his front door. The morning sun rose over the Atlanta skyline, casting a brilliant golden light across the surface of the river. It was an absolutely perfect day for a grand opening. The air was crisp and clear, completely washing away the heavy, dark storm from the night before. I stood on the sidewalk a block away, watching the massive structure of the Azure Waterfront Resort gleaming in the bright daylight. It was a towering monument of glass and steel, stretching up into the clouds. From the outside, it looked like an absolute architectural masterpiece. It looked like the crowning achievement of a brilliant real estate developer. But I knew the actual truth hiding behind the shiny glass windows. I knew the steel columns were cheap and compromised. I knew the concrete foundation was cracked and rushed. I knew the entire beautiful building was nothing but a fragile house of cards waiting for a single sudden gust of wind to knock it all down. And today, I was the wind. I had spent the early morning hours preparing myself for this exact moment. The baggy gray prison sweatpants and the cheap faded canvas shoes were finally gone. They had served their necessary purpose, keeping me invisible while I moved the pieces into place. Today, I was stepping back into my rightful position. I wore a stunning custom-tailored white power suit. The thick, expensive fabric was immaculate, cutting a sharp, commanding silhouette that projected absolute authority. I wore my hair pulled back, sleek and elegant. I did not wear any jewelry. True, undeniable power does not need heavy diamonds or flashy accessories to shine. I looked at my reflection in the tinted glass of a nearby storefront. The tired, broken woman who walked out of the federal penitentiary just a few days ago was entirely dead. The undisputed queen of Atlanta commercial real estate was officially back. I began walking toward the main entrance of the luxury resort. The massive front plaza was completely transformed into a sprawling, luxurious event space. There were hundreds of people gathered under the massive white VIP tents. The elite of high society were all there wearing their expensive designer clothes and sipping early morning champagne from tall crystal flutes. I saw the local city politicians who had happily taken my campaign contributions for years now laughing and shaking hands with my enemies. I saw the wealthy international investors looking eager to dump their foreign capital into the next big lucrative project. I saw rows and rows of local and national press correspondents, their cameras flashing, constantly capturing every single moment of the grand spectacle. At the very center of the crowded plaza was a massive elevated wooden stage. Behind the stage, an enormous LED screen displayed the glowing blue corporate logo of the Sterling Holding Company. And standing right in the middle of the stage, bathed in the bright morning sunlight, was Preston. He was wearing a brand new tailored suit, trying desperately to look like a visionary corporate leader. He was holding a pair of giant golden ceremonial scissors, resting them casually on his shoulder as he spoke into the microphone. He was delivering a passionate, heavily rehearsed speech about legacy and vision and overcoming adversity. He talked smoothly about how the Azure Resort was going to single-handedly revitalize the entire downtown riverfront district. He thanked his foreign investors for their incredible trust and generous financial support. He smiled brightly for the flashing press cameras, projecting a flawless image of absolute, unstoppable success. But even from a distance, I could see the cracks in his perfect facade. I could see the thick, shiny layer of nervous sweat forming on his forehead. I could see the slight, uncontrollable tremor in his hands as he gripped the golden scissors. He was absolutely terrified. He was expecting his violent, anonymous creditors to show up at any moment and drag him into an alley. He was praying that this morning press conference would secure the foreign cash he desperately needed to save his life. He did not realize his actual executioner was already walking right up the front steps of his precious resort. As I approached the edge of the plush red carpet, a heavy line of private security guards immediately spotted me. Preston had clearly given his security team a detailed description of me and strict, explicit orders to keep me out of the plaza at all costs. 3 massive men wearing black suits and communication earpieces broke away from the perimeter line and started rushing directly toward me. Their faces were aggressive, and their hands were reaching out fully, intending to physically tackle me to the ground right in front of the international press. I did not stop walking. I did not even break my confident stride or show a single ounce of fear or hesitation. Just as the largest security guard lunged forward to grab my arms, 2 dark, unmarked federal SUVs swerved violently onto the plaza, coming to a screeching halt right behind me. The heavy car doors flew open simultaneously. My brilliant corporate lawyer, Chloe, stepped out of the first vehicle wearing a sharp charcoal suit and carrying her heavy leather briefcase. But she was not alone. Flanking her on both sides, pouring out of the vehicles, were 6 fully armed United States federal marshals wearing dark tactical gear and heavy protective vests. The federal marshals stepped cleanly and quickly in front of me, forming an impenetrable human wall of law enforcement. The lead marshal raised his hand and flashed a heavy gold federal badge directly in the face of the aggressive security guards. He ordered them to step back immediately. His voice was loud and commanding, cutting through the noise of the crowd. He informed the private guards that they were actively interfering with an ongoing, highly classified federal operation, and if they touched me, they would be arrested for assaulting a protected federal informant. The security guards froze, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming presence of federal agents. They slowly raised their hands in surrender and backed away, melting nervously back into the edges of the crowd. The sudden violent commotion at the entrance sent a massive shockwave of confusion through the gathered guests. The polite upper-class murmurs and the soft clinking of expensive champagne glasses stopped instantly. Hundreds of heads turned simultaneously to see what was happening at the back of the plaza. The press photographers quickly pivoted away from Preston and pointed their long camera lenses directly at me. The entire crowd collectively gasped. The sound sucked all the air out of the plaza. They recognized my face immediately. I was the disgraced founder, the convicted felon, the toxic woman they had completely erased from their elite social circles and boardrooms 5 years ago. And here I was walking right through the front door of the biggest event of the year, wearing a pristine white suit, flanked by federal agents looking like an absolute unstoppable force of nature. I began walking slowly and deliberately down the center of the red carpet. The massive crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I looked directly at the faces of the people I passed. I saw the corrupt city council members looking nervously at the ground, refusing to meet my eyes. I saw the wealthy board members who had abandoned Preston yesterday, whispering frantically to each other, their faces pale with shock. They were all watching the ghost they buried come back to life in broad daylight to reclaim her throne. I reached the front of the elevated stage. Preston was standing completely frozen behind the wooden podium. The giant golden ceremonial scissors slipped from his trembling hands and clattered loudly onto the wooden floorboards. All the color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified animal trapped in a snare. He opened his mouth to speak to command security to remove me, to do absolutely anything, but no sound came out. He looked past me and saw the federal marshals actively securing the perimeter of the plaza, standing by the exits, ensuring no one could leave the event. He knew in that exact agonizing moment that his entire life was completely over. I walked up the short flight of stairs and stepped confidently onto the main stage. I walked right past him, not even giving him the basic satisfaction of a passing glance. I stepped up to the main podium, taking my rightful place at the center of the event, and looked out over the massive sea of shocked faces and flashing cameras. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored white suit jacket and pulled out my phone. I picked up the small digital connector cable resting lightly on the podium, the exact cable they were using to run the promotional presentation slides for the foreign investors, and plugged it directly into my device. I tapped the glass screen once. The massive glowing LED screen behind Preston suddenly flickered and glitched with a loud burst of static. The proud blue corporate logo of the Sterling Holding Company vanished, completely wiped from existence. The crowd let out another loud collective gasp as a brand new image appeared on the towering screen, illuminating the entire stage and reflecting in the eyes of the press. It was a high-resolution digital scan of the ancient yellow document I had retrieved from the underground vault the day before. It was a legally binding commercial property deed, but it was not just any standard property deed. It was the master ground lease for the exact piece of dirt we were all currently standing on, and signed boldly at the very bottom of the page, dated 20 long years ago, was my own unforgeable signature. The massive LED screen behind the stage glowed with the bright white image of the original property deed. The silence in the plaza was absolute. Hundreds of wealthy investors, politicians, and members of the press stared up at the giant document, trying to process what they were seeing. Preston stood a few feet away from me. He looked at the screen, and then he looked at me. His mind completely refused to accept reality. His brain simply snapped under the immense pressure. He started to laugh. It was not his usual charming, confident chuckle. It was a loud, manic, desperate laugh that echoed terribly across the quiet plaza. He pointed his shaking finger at me and turned to the crowd of investors. He yelled that I was completely insane. He told the press that this was nothing but a pathetic forged document created by a bitter, convicted felon who was desperately trying to ruin his grand opening. He shouted that he owned the Sterling Holding Company and he owned the Azure Waterfront Resort. He told everyone not to listen to a single word I said. I did not raise my voice to compete with his frantic screaming. I did not need to. I simply leaned closer to the microphone. I told the crowd that my son-in-law is a man who has always been deeply obsessed with shiny things. I said he loves the top-floor penthouses, he loves the crystal chandeliers, and he absolutely loves the expensive imported Italian marble. But I told them he has one very fatal flaw as a real estate developer. He has a terrible habit of never looking down at the dirt beneath his feet. I turned my head slightly to look directly at Preston. His manic laughter slowly died in his throat. I told him to look very closely at the signature at the bottom of the giant document. I explained to him and to the entire crowd of foreign investors the fundamental real estate concept of a ground lease. I kept my voice perfectly level and steady as a surgeon wielding a scalpel. I told the crowd that in commercial real estate development, it is entirely possible to own a massive towering skyscraper while somebody else entirely owns the actual earth that the skyscraper sits on. I told Preston that he spent the last 5 years completely destroying my family. I said he stole my corporate accounts, he liquidated my assets, and he drove himself into massive, insurmountable debt just to build this magnificent $50 million waterfront resort. But I told him he was far too arrogant to ever do the basic due diligence. I told him he was so eager to steal my legacy that he never bothered to thoroughly check the original county land registry. I told him that 10 long years ago, long before he ever met my daughter or plotted to steal my company, I recognized the immense value of this riverfront district. I bought this entire massive stretch of land. I bought it quietly and legally through a completely anonymous blind trust. I told Preston that he did not build his $50 million masterpiece on his own property. He built his towering, beautiful, fraudulent empire directly on top of my dirt. The color completely drained from his face. He stumbled backward, gripping the edge of the wooden podium to keep from collapsing. He stammered frantically into his own microphone. He said a commercial lease is an ironclad contract. He yelled that he had paid the land taxes and that I could not just walk in and take his building simply because I owned the empty ground underneath it. I smiled. It was the cold, absolute smile of a woman who had just trapped her prey in a steel cage. I told him he was absolutely right about contracts. I told him contracts are incredibly powerful things. I instructed him to look at Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the master ground lease displayed on the massive screen behind him. I read the clause out loud so every single camera and reporter in the plaza could hear me clearly. I explained that it was a strict morality and legal compliance clause. It explicitly stated that if the active tenant of the land ever uses the property to conduct illegal federal financial activities or engages in proven corporate fraud, the commercial ground lease is immediately and permanently terminated. I looked at the wealthy foreign investors sitting in the front row. I told them about the $5 million of stolen company funds Preston wired to a private offshore account in the Bahamas. I told the local reporters about the cheap, substandard steel he secretly purchased for the load-bearing columns. I told the entire city about the recurring wire transfers he used to actively bribe the chief building inspector to ignore the massive safety violations. Preston tried to interrupt me, screaming that I had absolutely no proof of those wild accusations. I told him the Federal Bureau of Investigation already has every single unredacted bank log, every hidden wire transfer, and every single photograph of his offshore accounts. I told him my brilliant lawyer had handed the entire completely organized file to the Criminal Division of the Internal Revenue Service yesterday afternoon. I told him the federal agents standing right behind me were not here to protect him. They were here to ensure the total seizure of his illegal assets. I turned fully toward Preston, delivering the absolute final devastating blow. I explained the basic legal consequence of a terminated commercial ground lease. I told him that by law, when the lease is voided due to criminal breach, every single permanent structure built upon that land immediately and irrevocably defaults back to the legal owner of the dirt. I told him I now own every single brick of this entire resort. I own the towering glass windows, the luxury spa, the infinity pools, the imported marble floors, and the glittering crystal chandeliers. I told him he did all the heavy lifting. I said he stole all the money, he alienated all his friends, he ruined his marriage, and he took all the massive legal risks. He did all of that just to build me a brand new $50 million hotel, absolutely free of charge. The silence in the plaza was completely shattered by the deafening roar of the press. Hundreds of camera shutters fired rapidly, capturing the exact moment a man lost his entire soul. Reporters began shouting questions into the morning air. The wealthy foreign investors immediately stood up from their chairs, turning their backs on the stage and rushing furiously toward the exits, trying desperately to distance themselves from the massive federal crime scene. Preston did not scream. He did not try to attack me or threaten my life like he did in the quiet diner the night before. His mind finally understood the absolute terrifying magnitude of his defeat. He realized he had never actually been the master manipulator he thought he was. He had simply been a useful, arrogant pawn, walking blindly into a trap that I had set 10 years in advance. His knees physically buckled beneath him. He collapsed onto the hard wooden floorboards of the stage right in front of the podium. He knelt there in his ruined, expensive suit, surrounded by the shattered pieces of his fake empire, staring blankly at the ground. He was finally looking down at the dirt, but it was far too late. It was my dirt, and he had absolutely nowhere left to stand. The plaza was suspended in an absolute terrified silence. The massive LED screen showing the ground lease burned bright white, casting long shadows across the wooden stage. Preston remained on his knees, staring at the floorboards, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The reality of his complete financial and social destruction was finally crashing down upon him. He had spent the last 5 years building an elaborate, impenetrable fortress of lies, and in less than 5 minutes I had reduced it entirely to dust. I watched his shoulders tremble. I watched the expensive fabric of his tailored suit stretch as his body tensed with a sudden dark energy. The despair that had briefly forced him to his knees suddenly mutated into something much more dangerous. It turned into pure, unadulterated, violent rage. He was a man who had never been told no. He was a man who believed his skin color and his smooth southern charm gave him an absolute divine right to take whatever he wanted from anyone he deemed beneath him. And now, a black woman he had thrown into a federal prison had just publicly stripped him of his wealth, his freedom, and his dignity in front of the entire international business community. Preston let out a guttural, animalistic scream that tore through the quiet morning air. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes completely bloodshot and wild with madness. He did not care about the flashing cameras. He did not care about the wealthy foreign investors watching his every move. He lunged directly at me. He closed the distance between us in a fraction of a second, his hands reaching out like claws aimed directly at my throat. He screamed that he was going to kill me. He yelled that he was going to tear me apart with his bare hands and that I would never live to see him lose his empire. I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch or raise my hands to protect my face. I stood perfectly still, rooted to the stage like a massive oak tree. I knew I was completely safe. Before his hands could even brush the fabric of my white custom-tailored suit, a blur of dark tactical gear intercepted him. The federal marshals who had been flanking me moved with terrifying speed and precision. 2 massive officers slammed into Preston from the side, hitting him with so much force that his feet completely left the wooden floorboards. They tackled him violently to the ground, pinning him down hard against the stage. Preston thrashed and screamed, fighting like a wild beast, trying desperately to break free, but the officers pressed their heavy knees into his back, forcing the breath out of his lungs. Suddenly, the loud wail of heavy sirens echoed down the city streets, rapidly approaching the plaza. From the back of the massive crowd, a dozen more armed federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS printed on the back stormed the event. They pushed through the panicked crowd of high society guests and politicians who were now scrambling frantically to get out of the way. Leading the tactical raid was Special Agent Davis. He was a tall, stern man with graying hair who had spent the last 5 years quietly building this exact case with the information I fed him from inside the prison walls. He walked up the short flight of stairs and stepped onto the stage, his heavy boots thudding against the wood. He looked down at Preston, who was still struggling uselessly beneath the weight of the federal marshals. Agent Davis pulled a thick stack of folded legal warrants from his jacket pocket. He did not shout, but his voice carried a heavy absolute authority that commanded the entire plaza. He addressed Preston Sterling, directly reading the charges out loud so every single member of the press could record them. He announced that Preston was under immediate federal arrest. He listed the massive web of charges methodically: wire fraud, bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, international money laundering, and the absolute heaviest charge of them all, criminal conspiracy under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, perfectly known as RICO. Preston stopped struggling. The word RICO hung in the air like a death sentence. It was the exact federal statute designed to dismantle massive organized crime syndicates. It meant they were not just coming for him. They were coming for his bank accounts, his properties, his hidden offshore trusts, and every single corrupt politician and building inspector who had ever taken a bribe from him. Agent Davis looked at the cameras and explained exactly how the federal government had built their airtight case. He announced that the massive $50 million waterfront resort they were currently standing on was actively funded by illegal shell corporations. He stated that the concrete evidence proving this massive conspiracy was meticulously gathered, documented, and surrendered to the federal government by a highly classified confidential informant. Agent Davis slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. He gave me a small, respectful nod, acknowledging the 5 years of absolute hell I had endured just to hand them the keys to Preston Sterling's entire criminal network. I looked down at Preston. His face was pressed hard against the wooden stage, his cheek resting dangerously close to the giant golden ceremonial scissors he had dropped just moments before. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically between me and the federal agents. The realization of my 5-year plan finally crystallized in his mind. He finally understood that while he thought I was rotting away in a concrete cell, crying over my lost empire, I was actually sitting in the prison library with a forensic accountant tracing every single dirty dollar he ever spent. I was the architect of his total destruction. The federal marshals pulled Preston roughly to his feet. They twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed perfectly into the microphone still resting on the podium. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It sounded exactly like freedom. Agent Davis began reading Preston his Miranda rights, telling him he had the right to remain silent and that anything he said would absolutely be used against him in a court of law. Preston did not try to speak. His arrogant, lying mouth was finally shut. His perfectly styled hair was a messy, tangled disaster, and his expensive suit was torn and covered in dust from the stage floor. The federal agents began leading him toward the edge of the stage. The press corps surged forward, completely ignoring the security perimeters. Hundreds of camera flashes erupted simultaneously, creating a blinding strobe light effect across the plaza. Reporters shoved microphones toward his face, shouting rapid-fire questions, asking him about the bribes, the mistresses, and the stolen corporate funds. This was his grand opening. This was the moment he had planned for months, expecting to be crowned the king of Atlanta real estate. Instead, he was being paraded in front of the international media, doing a humiliating perp walk in heavy chains. The wealthy investors who had flown halfway across the world to give him their money were now dialing their lawyers, frantically trying to erase any connection they had to the Sterling Holding Company. As the agents dragged him down the short flight of stairs toward the waiting armored federal vehicles, Preston forced his feet to stop moving for just one single second. He twisted his body around, fighting the grip of the marshals, just to look back at the stage one last time. He wanted to see the exact woman who had beaten him. I was standing exactly where he had been standing just 10 minutes ago. I was standing directly behind the main wooden podium, right in the center of the massive stage, with my name and my unforgeable signature glowing brightly on the giant screen behind me. A terrified catering waiter, who had been completely frozen in shock near the side of the stage, was still holding a silver tray covered with crystal glasses of expensive vintage champagne. I walked slowly over to the waiter. I did not say a word, but I offered him a soft, polite smile. I reached out and gently picked up one of the tall crystal flutes. I walked back to the center of the stage. I looked down through the blinding flashes of the press cameras and locked my eyes directly onto Preston's bloodshot, terrified stare. He was a broken, defeated man, about to spend the rest of his natural life trapped in the exact same concrete nightmare he had built for me. I did not gloat. I did not scream insults or tell him to rot in hell. True power does not require a loud voice. I simply stood tall in my pristine white suit, raised the crystal glass of champagne into the air in a silent mock toast to his absolute failure, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cool, crisp liquid tasted exactly like total victory. Preston let out one final broken sob before the federal marshals yanked him violently forward, dragging him completely out of sight and shoving him into the back of the dark, armored vehicle. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a definitive finality. I stood on the stage listening to the sirens fade into the distance. The fraudulent empire was completely dead, and the true Queen of Atlanta had officially reclaimed her throne. 6 months had passed since the morning the federal agents swarmed the plaza and dragged my arrogant son-in-law away in heavy steel chains. The harsh, freezing winter wind was blowing against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my newly restored corner office on the 50th floor. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk, sipping a hot cup of dark black coffee. The silence in the room was completely peaceful. There was no more hiding in cheap roadside motels. There were no more baggy gray prison sweatpants or faded canvas shoes. I had systematically reclaimed every single corporate asset, every commercial building, and every stolen dollar that rightfully belonged to me. The empire was completely mine again, cleaner and far more powerful than it had ever been before. Mounted on the far wall of my immaculate office was a large flat-screen television tuned to the national news network. I picked up the remote control and turned up the volume just as a bright red breaking news banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. The news anchor was standing outside the massive stone pillars of the federal courthouse downtown. The highly publicized criminal trial of Preston Sterling had finally reached its absolute conclusion. The screen cut to live footage of Preston being led out of the heavy courtroom doors by armed federal marshals. He was no longer the handsome, charming high society real estate developer who wore custom-tailored suits and sipped expensive imported champagne. He looked entirely hollow, completely pale, and physically broken. He was wearing a bright orange heavy canvas prison jumpsuit. His wrists and his ankles were bound together with thick, heavy iron shackles that clanked loudly against the pavement with every slow, defeated step he took. He kept his head hung low, staring blankly at the ground, completely stripped of his arrogant pride and his toxic ego. The news anchor read the final official verdict into the microphone. The federal judge did not show Preston a single ounce of mercy or leniency. The judge had looked at the overwhelming mountain of unredacted bank logs, hidden wire transfers, and explicit bribery records that I had meticulously provided and called Preston a mastermind of absolute corporate greed. The judge called him a manipulative, dangerous predator who willingly destroyed the lives of his own family members just to finance a fraudulent luxury lifestyle. The sentence was handed down cold, absolute, and completely unyielding. Preston was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There was absolutely no chance for early release. There was no possibility of parole. He would be an old, forgotten, gray-haired man by the time he ever saw the outside of a concrete wall again. I watched him being shoved roughly into the back of the armored federal transport van, and I felt absolutely nothing but a profound sense of cold, perfect justice. He got exactly what he deserved. But the news broadcast did not just detail the criminal sentencing of Preston. It also highlighted the absolute total collapse of the entire Sterling family legacy. Preston elitist aristocratic mother Diane had tried desperately to save her precious golden boy from the federal government. She had frantically liquidated every single financial asset she owned to pay for a massive team of elite criminal defense attorneys. But she was far too late. The federal agents had already seized the Sterling Family Foundation, completely freezing her bank accounts due to her direct involvement in the international money laundering scheme. The proud, arrogant woman who had cornered me outside the church, who had offered me $50,000 and told me to go back to the ghetto, had lost absolutely everything. The banks foreclosed on her sprawling generational estate. The government seized her silver Bentley. She was permanently and publicly expelled from the exclusive wealthy country club she loved so much. Diane Sterling was now completely bankrupt, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the rough side of town, relying on government assistance just to buy her weekly groceries. The wealthy high society friends who used to drink her expensive wine and attend her lavish charity galas entirely abandoned her the exact moment her family name became associated with federal racketeering. Her pristine social image was completely shattered, and she was forced to live out the rest of her days in the exact same poverty she used to mock. But the most profound tragedy of this entire massive collapse belonged entirely to my daughter. I did not need to watch the television news to know exactly where Jasmine was. I knew exactly where she ended up because my private investigators kept a very quiet distance, observing the harsh, brutal reality of her new life. It was late at night, pouring cold, heavy rain over the dark city streets, just like the terrible night she came begging and crying at my motel door. Jasmine was standing behind the greasy, stained counter of a cheap 24-hour roadside diner on the absolute worst side of town. It was the exhausting graveyard shift. Her expensive designer silk dresses and her sparkling diamond necklaces were completely gone. They were replaced by a cheap, stiff polyester uniform that smelled permanently of burnt frying oil and stale coffee. Her perfect, expensive hair was tied back in a messy, frizzy knot, and her skin was pale and broken out from the overwhelming stress. The hands that used to hold solid gold pens to sign away millions of dollars were now rough red and covered in painful blisters from washing endless towering stacks of dirty ceramic plates in scalding hot water. She spent her long, miserable nights serving aggressive drunk truck drivers and impatient, exhausted travelers. They did not care that she used to live in a luxury penthouse. They snapped their fingers at her, yelled at her when their food was cold, and left absolutely nothing but a few sticky coins on the table for a tip. She was completely and entirely alone. There was no penthouse waiting for her. There were no luxury cars, and absolutely no charming husband to protect her from the harsh cruelty of the real world. I had spent my entire youth scrubbing hotel floors until my knees bled just so she would never have to know what this kind of bone-crushing manual labor felt like. I gave her the world on a silver platter, and she threw it directly into the garbage. Now the universe was forcing her to learn the exact same brutal lessons I had learned, except she had to learn them completely by herself. Around 2 a.m, the diner was mostly empty. A tired traveling businessman sitting in one of the cracked vinyl booths finally paid his cheap bill and walked out the glass doors into the pouring rain. He had left a glossy magazine sitting on the sticky table. Jasmine picked up a wet, dirty rag from the counter and walked slowly over to clean the booth, dragging her aching feet across the greasy linoleum floor. She reached down to grab the abandoned magazine and throw it into the trash can, but her hands suddenly froze completely. The bright overhead fluorescent lights glared down on the glossy front cover. It was the newest monthly issue of Forbes magazine, and staring right back at her from the center of the cover was my face. I was wearing my pristine, custom-tailored white power suit. I was sitting behind my massive mahogany desk, looking directly into the camera lens with a calm, absolute, undeniable authority. The bold black headline printed directly below my picture was impossible to ignore. It called me the unstoppable queen of Atlanta commercial real estate, who brilliantly dismantled a massive corporate fraud to take back her multi-million-dollar empire. Jasmine stood frozen in the dim, greasy diner, holding the magazine in her rough, blistered hands. Her entire body began to shake violently. The absolute crushing weight of her reality finally broke her completely. Hot, bitter tears filled her eyes, spilling over her pale cheeks and dropping silently onto the glossy paper of the magazine cover. She looked at my strong, powerful face, smiling back at her from the top of the business world, and then she slowly looked around at the cheap, cracked walls and the dirty floors of her miserable new life. She realized in that exact agonizing moment that this was completely permanent. There was no apology that could fix this. There was no magic phone call she could make to beg her way back into my good graces. The invisible bridge between us was completely burned to ash and scattered in the wind. She knew deeply and painfully that she had absolutely no one to blame but herself. She had traded a mother who loved her unconditionally and built an empire for her for a cruel, manipulative man who used her as a disposable human shield. She had chosen blind greed and high society vanity over blood loyalty. She had tried to bury me in the dark so she could wear my crown. And now she had to spend the rest of her natural life serving cheap coffee in the miserable shadows, completely forgotten by the world, while the mother she callously betrayed ruled the entire city from the sunlit top floor. Karma had finally arrived, and it was served absolutely ice cold. I turned away from the television screen and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office. The city of Atlanta stretched out before me, glittering in the cold winter sunlight. It was a beautiful sight, but the view inside my office was even better. Through the heavy glass doors, I could see the bustling activity of my corporate headquarters. The loyal employees who had been fired or pushed out by Preston were back at their desks. Clarice, the brave bank teller, who risked everything to hand me the evidence, was now the senior vice president of my private financial trust. Chloe, my brilliant young attorney, was occupying the executive general counsel office right next door. I had not just survived the ultimate betrayal. I had completely weaponized my trauma. I took the absolute worst thing that could ever happen to a mother, and I used it to forge an indestructible armor. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer the calloused hands of a terrified young mother scrubbing hotel floors. They were the steady hands of a woman who had taken back her entire world. For 5 long years, the people I loved most in this world tried to bury me in the dark. They forged my name, they stole my life savings, and they threw me into a cold concrete cell, expecting me to simply wither away and die quietly. They thought burying me in a cell would break my spirit. They did not realize they were just planting a seed. In that absolute darkness, I grew deep, unshakable roots. I learned the hard way that blood does not make you family, and loyalty is not something you can steal with a forged signature or a fake society smile. My real family was sitting right outside my office doors, working hard to build a legacy based on actual respect and mutual survival. The pain of losing my only daughter will always be a deep scar I carry, but it no longer controls me. I no longer look for her in the crowds or hope for a miraculous apology. I chose my peace and my dignity over her toxic greed, and it was the most liberating decision I have ever made in my entire 62 years of life. I stepped out of those prison gates with absolutely nothing but a cheap pair of gray sweatpants and a sharp mind. Today, I own the skyline. Before I sign off, I want to ask you a very important question. Have you ever had to let go of a toxic child or family member to protect your own peace and legacy? It is the hardest choice a person can make, but sometimes it is the only way to survive. Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one of them. Hit subscribe to join our community of strong survivors. And please always remember, never give up your crown for someone who only wants your gold. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and never let anyone steal your throne. The ultimate lesson I learned is that blood does not automatically mean family. Society demands we forgive relatives unconditionally, but sometimes the most toxic predators share our DNA. You cannot sacrifice your peace, your freedom, or your legacy for someone who views you simply as a disposable stepping stone. True strength is knowing when to lock the heavy door and let them face the brutal storm they created. Healing begins the exact moment you stop setting yourself on fire to keep your betrayers warm. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family to protect your sanity? Share your story in the comments below and hit subscribe.